A Man of the Mountain. Chapter 1. Routine. The snow had just begun to fall when Jonas opened the tired wooden door of his cabin and stepped outside. The warmth at his back swallowed instantly by the chilled mountain air. A pair of massive fur-covered snowshoes jangled restlessly at his side. The sky had taken on an orange tint as the sun sank low in its arc. It was only 3:30, and it was clear the days were still growing shorter. In the distance, dark clouds were building. Jonas knew that by nightfall, the snow could be several feet deep. While most would have been preparing for the oncoming storm, he felt completely at ease. The worse the weather, the less likely he would be to run into hikers on the upper trails. Tourists tended to turn back at the first sign of inclement weather. Over the years, Jonas had become adept at navigating the mountain through clear skies and whiteouts. He would need to be cautious, but the storm wouldn't be a problem. The cabin he called home for the last 5 years was positioned 5 miles off the nearest hiking trail. The terrain leading to it was largely considered impassable. Occasionally, there were some overzealous youths who fancied themselves explorers, but Jonas tried to think about them as little as possible. They never made it very far, and ended up paying the ultimate price for their foolishness. He took one last look at the warmth of his cabin windows, picked up his pack, and promised to have a good drink by the fire upon his return. The trees around his cabin shook as the wind blew through them with a hollow whine. Jonas popped in a pair of earbuds and put on a classic rock playlist. The foreboding noises of the forest were drowned out by a riff from Rush. It was a song about warring trees, and he chuckled as he began his walk. The way to the main trail was treacherous, running the gamut between steep ravines and technical rocky switchbacks. When Jonas had arrived, the path was nearly impassable. Over the years, he had slowly worked away at it, making each trip a little easier, at least for someone who knew his way. For others, one step could mean the difference between life and death. Spending every waking moment on the mountain made Jonas sure-footed. Walking through the forest filled him with a sense of pride. He considered how blessed the last 5 years had been. Back in the city, something as simple as ordering a cup of coffee was a struggle. The navigation of small talk was like strolling through a minefield. Often, by the time he had thought of something to say, minutes had passed and people were staring. As a result, he had made the decision to live reclusively, which, in a small town, wasn't exactly accepted. While Jonas might have been slightly abnormal in his distaste for conversation, he was otherwise ordinary. He possessed a slightly above-average IQ, moderate good looks, and was tall enough that no one questioned him for long. Overall, he had rolled lucky genetic dice, and he hated it. His appearance made others think he was approachable, and that just made things harder. Despite his retreat into the mountains, Jonas had still managed to keep himself clean-shaven, resisting the urge to grow his beard out to mythical proportions. Though he never saw anyone, self-grooming had become a ritual, and there was comfort in repetition. On most days, his activities followed a set plan, and he took great ease from the structure. No interruptions, no distractions, just life. By the time he reached the main hiking trails, the clear skies had turned slate grey and heavy white flakes were falling intermittently. He stopped, unshouldered his pack, and took out his earbuds with a sigh. The storm will be good for deterring hikers, but it meant he wasn't going to be leaving any tracks either.
Guess I'll just have to do with a few slashes and samples.
Jonas's employers weren't particular about how he worked, so long as he got the job done. He unclipped the snowshoes and examined them for abnormalities. They had been specially designed to leave authentic footprints. Any variation might tip off an eager cryptozoologist to the fallacy. While they were covered in brown fur, the tread had been constructed from an artificial, semi-soft plastic meant to resemble organic material. Jonas wasn't sure how closely anyone would check the tracks he left, but his employer's word was law. Satisfied that they were in working order, Jonas strapped the shoes on and pulled the rest of his suit from the bag. To the untrained eye, it might have just appeared to be a bundle of matted fur. To Jonas, it was his second life. With ease, he slipped into the suit, fastened it tight, and pulled up the thick hood. It had been reinforced to make his head appear about twice its normal size, and was great for keeping out the chill. The finishing touch to the ensemble was a pair of gloves meant to look like large furry paws. Embedded in the tip of each finger was a long, razor-sharp claw. He slid his hands in and swiped experimentally at a tree to his left, leaving 4 long gouges in the bark. The claws tore through the wood like tissue paper, sending strips of wood flying. Satisfied, Jonas grinned. In the suit, he felt more like himself than he did anywhere else. He buried his pack in the snow beneath the tree he had marked, and set off. Even with the empty slopes, Jonas kept his performance authentic. His casual walk became a thick lumber. Every breath was a primal grunt. Ordinarily, he would have stuck to the higher elevation trails, but the weather provided a unique opportunity. The closer he got to the beginner hiking areas, the more likely his samples were to be discovered.
No one makes the History Channel without taking a few risks.
Once he felt it was close enough, Jonas started the real work. For hours, he ran through the growing storm, snapping small trees like twigs, slashing at bark, and occasionally ripping out a chunk of fur to leave on a branch. The samples had been custom curated by his employer to be unidentifiable and able to withstand harsh conditions. The wind whipped, snow fell in heavy flakes, and Jonas listened gleefully as his howls echoed off the empty forest surrounding him. The evening was perfect. He felt a lightness in his heart that was rare, even on the best of days. Jonas turned his head towards the sky to stare into the abyss above and became lost in the snowfall. A blinding white light erupted from the trees, shattering his calm and freezing Jonas in place.
Oh no.
He felt the happiness melt out of him, leaving behind a cold lump in his chest. The light was unmistakably directed at him, and despite the thicket between him and the source, he knew he had been seen. Knowing already what the answer was, Jonas turned his head to look for the source. Not 10 feet away was a frost-covered hiker in a bright orange coat, visibly shivering. Shit! And today was going so well.
Hello? Oh, thank goodness I found you. I got lost and can't seem to make my way back to the main trail.
The hiker's voice quavered. How could I have missed him? The answer was obvious. You were careless, you stupid son of a bitch.
Sir, I can see you there. Can you please help me? My cell is dead.
Turn the light away, idiot. Jonas could only pretend for so long.
Please help me.
The tremor in his voice grew. Should have just walked away. Jonas took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the trees. The white light nearly blinded him, and he lifted a massive fur-covered arm to shield his eyes. At a distance, the suit might have seemed intimidating, but in the cold close-up of a flashlight, there was no way the hiker would believe it. The hiker stared forward, silent, confused. Jonas let out what he intended to be a primal yowl, but it died in his throat along the way. Oh, that practice for nothing. He stamped the large snowshoes, kicking up miniature flurries, adding to the storm. It did the trick. The hiker turned and started to run. The light of the flashlight was suddenly gone, leaving the forest in full dark once more. Jonas watched as the cone of light bounced away. Maybe he'll run off a cliff or freeze to death. It was no use. He was out of options. The risk of the hiker making it back down the mountain was too great, and his employers had been very specific about loose ends. Jonas steeled himself and took chase. It had taken a while in the early years, but as time passed, he became quite adept at running in the snowshoes. In no time at all, he caught up to the man who was stumbling and tripping his way through the growing snowpack.
I'm really sorry about this.
Jonas raised his hand to strike. He took careful aim at the man's neck, but stumbled at the last moment and struck him in the torso. Jonas's claws found their way between the hiker's ribs and into his lungs. The hiker fell forward into the snow, pulling Jonas along with him. His claws punched further into the hiker as he landed on top of him, crunching through muscle and bone and out the front of his chest. Together, they briefly slid through the snow like a macabre toboggan, leaving a deep red swath in the pure white snow behind them. Jonas lay upon the hiker with his claws still buried deep, panting from the exertion. He had to fight back revulsion. It was his messiest kill to date and hadn't been quick by any stretch. Jonas stood, the front of his suit soaked with blood, and his claws still wedged tight between the hiker's ribs. He yanked his arms back, lifting the hiker to his knees where the claws dislodged and slid free with a sickening squelch. The hiker gagged and spluttered, trying desperately to breathe but inhaling only his own blood. Oh God. A sickening feeling of dread began to churn in his stomach. The hiker reached one gloved hand out, as if still expecting help. His eyes bulged, pleading, terrified. Jesus. Persistent, I'll give you that. He always tried to make the end quick, but had missed his mark this time. Death was bad enough when the executioner was a professional. He stepped forward and pressed his claws against the hiker's throat. I'm sorry. Then plunged his claws through the hiker's neck, ending his life with a hollow gurgle. The forest went silent. Jonas was alone once again. Pulling the claws out, Jonas collapsed back into the snow, panting and watching the steam rise off the hiker's mangled corpse. Dizziness and nausea swept over him. Botched kills were never easy to look at.
That's why there are signs, moron! Don't stay in the park after dark!
The sound of his voice echoed back to him. Shouting the rules into the ether made him feel almost justified. After a few minutes, he managed to stand. The storm had briefly abated, allowing pale moonlight to illuminate the scene. It was grisly, but looked genuine. Despite the ugly nature of it, Jonas had done his job and done it well. He took off one of his gloves and pulled out a small cell phone. With frozen fingers, he typed.
Bigfoot kills again. Third hiker found on the north side of the mountain this year.
He looked it over, added his GPS location, and pressed send. Chapter 2. the news. The hike back to the cabin was always harder, and made worse by the persistent images of the bloody hiker stealing Jonas's every thought. He didn't feel remorse so much as disgust.
I'll have to do better next time.
The chill had also crept deep into his limbs, despite the suit's insulation. He felt a strange mix of pride and melancholy.
Clearly I need to study more.
Over the years, Jonas had researched exactly where to strike to quicken death, but in the heat of the moment, precision was difficult. The kill had looked authentic, but guilt for the hiker's pain had nestled in the back of his mind. In the end, he knew killing the man had been just business and couldn't be helped, but the suffering that had gone along with it was squarely on him. Through the trees, he could see the cabin's single light, like a beacon in the darkness. His rumination was interrupted by the sight of a brown paper package on his doorstep. The supply drops from his employers were the only contact he received from the outside world, and the only kind he wanted. He stepped out of his snowshoes, picked up the package and went inside. The embers in the fireplace had gone out, but the cabin's warmth was still a stark relief from the cold outside. He took a moment to feel the heat prickle through his leaden hands. The drink he had promised himself called, but there was work to be done first. Jonas took off his boots and put the package down by his chair, trying not to drip any blood on the carpet. He then moved to the back of the cabin where there was a large furnace disguised as a hot water heater. Just the sight of it was enough to ease his tension. He stripped off his suit and everything beneath it, careful not to leave any evidence as he put each piece into the garbage bags. The furnace was a clean slate, erasing everything but the legend that was left by his deeds. The fires within were the closest thing he knew to a benevolent god. Concealed on the right side of the furnace was a small toggle. Jonas flipped it and listened to the sound of the flames igniting below. He removed the cover of the hot water heater and pulled open a hatch, revealing a black chute with a deep orange glow beneath it. He took the bags and savoured the sound they made as they slid down the chute to the chasm below. For a moment, he just stood, naked, listening to the muted bangs of the expanding steel in the cold winter air. It was all so familiar, and he found comfort in the routine. Slowly, he breathed in and out, holding each lungful as long as possible. Invigoration spread through him at the sound of the clothes burning, and he found the energy to go pour the drink he had promised himself. Sitting in the back of a dusty cabinet in his small kitchen was an unmarked bottle of brown liquid. Jonas rinsed out a tumbler that had been sitting next to the sink and filled it. Through the tiny window, he could see heavy flakes continuing to fall. That's going to be a bitch to shovel in the morning. He lifted the glass to his lips and drank slowly, savouring every drop. His employers only dropped booze on celebratory occasions, making it rare. A tentative mental ease began to settle over his mind. He walked the short distance from the kitchen to the living room and sat down in a moth-eaten easy chair. On an end table next to it was a coaster and a remote. Jonas set his drink down and turned on the television. Getting reception without a paper trail had been tricky, but it was his one condition for employment. Slowly, the screen warmed up, and Jonas saw the familiar logo of the History Channel in the top right corner. He never changed the channel. They were the only reliable source for news on the strange and mythological, at least when it wasn't airing reruns about the exploits of pawn shop owners. Jonas followed the cryptozoology programs religiously. They had been his inspiration for years. He took another drink, and sweet fire ran down the back of his throat. The cabin took on a muted coziness. The walls of the cabin creaked from the heavy wind outside, but it was no longer his problem. He was in a safe place, watching his favourite program, and he had done the work of legends. A familiar theme song started up and Jonas turned his attention to the TV.
Tonight on Manson's Mysteries, the thrilling conclusion to our three-part hunt of Mexico's legendary chupacabra.
The title screen faded away to reveal a handsome man in a khaki suit, standing in the desert.
It has been 14 days in this oppressive heat, and we've finally caught up to what might be our greatest adversary yet.
Manson was one of Jonas's heroes. He always seemed so poised and collected. Even in the scorching heat of the Mexican desert, his brow barely beaded with sweat and his demeanor was relaxed. The man was tactical, resourceful, and most importantly, brought legitimacy to myths that most deemed fantasy. He was the reckoning, and Jonas knew that one day, if he was lucky enough, he would face him. Seeing the Chupacabra's coverage filled Jonas with jealousy. It was a much easier myth to maintain than his own, assuming, of course, that it was a myth. While most Bigfoot sightings in the area could be attributed to Jonas, he had no idea what other myths his employers funded. Either way, the fabled desert bloodsucker had a simpler legend with less carnage. Sure, some pets would get eaten, but the people the Chupacabra encountered left with their lives. Sasquatch, on the other hand, had a long and bloody history, decimating mining towns and dismembered hikers in its wake. There had been a few gimmicky television shows where enthusiasts would go hunting Bigfoot in the woods, but they were inevitably cancelled. In the end, their handheld camera footage was easily spotted as forgery, and the majority of their samples were just dog fur. Most of the people who truly believed in the myth weren't out for their 15 minutes of fame and stayed quiet about it. Jonas had run into one of these believers setting up cameras in the woods, only miles from his cabin. It had not ended well. Jonas drained his tumbler. The real item was Manson's Mysteries. Yes, like most shows on the History Channel, it was cheesy, but Manson was the real deal. Jonas had spent hours poring through the darkest corners of the internet researching Rick Manson. If the rumours were true, he was part of an ancient monster hunting society that very few were admitted to. Beneath the plastic smile and the well-lit promos, Jonas knew Manson was a hunter. He returned his attention to the program and saw Rick standing with an arm around a dazed child. The boy staggered and nearly fell. Manson steadied him, explaining how chupacabras drain their victims of blood and that the poor child was likely anemic.
If we had not been here an hour earlier, this young man might not have been as lucky. Thanks to our excellent team, he's going home safe tonight.
Manson patted the child's head a little too aggressively, causing him to wobble and nearly fall over. A hand reached from off-screen to steady the child and moved just as quickly out of frame. Jonas reached to his side and slid the box he had brought in from the porch out in front of him. He took out a knife and sliced through the packing tape. Inside was the usual: new boots, gloves, suit, as well as other provisions for the week. How they knew when he was going to need it, Jonas would never understand, but he was thankful for their timeliness. As he pulled out the items, he found a small note rolled up. It simply read, "Keep up the good work." Beneath it was a copy of the local Eye, a tabloid from Clearwater, and the only source willing to report on the attacks. The headline alone made Jonas's heart soar. Mysterious creature kills again. He read on to find the reporter critical of the statement from local authorities, claiming the deaths on the mountain had simply been bear attacks. All signs indicate that there has been no movement in the local bear populations and no significant events to disturb hibernation patterns. Once again, we must urge hikers to use caution when out late in the day and into the evening. The paper went on to speculate about the origins of the attacks, citing several out-of-focus images of Sasquatch. Jonas couldn't help but laugh. The images were obvious forgery and had nothing to do with him, but any coverage was good coverage. He read on and felt a light flutter as he came to the final line. "We are making an open plea to the monster hunting community. We know you're out there. Please, come and investigate before we lose more innocent lives." Jonas felt a wave of elation wash over him, and his heart beat fast in his chest. He had to read the line 3 times just to believe it was real. The chance that someone like Manson would actually come was slim, but any chance at all was better than none. Below the article was a picture of a woman that had spotted him a week earlier. Recently, hikers have been getting bolder, even in the winter months. That was a good death. Over the years, he had researched exactly where to strike during a confrontation. While none of it could be said to be painless, most of the time, he was able to make it quick. The grislier deaths made for better headlines, but Jonas saw no need for extra suffering at an already unpleasant occasion. He read over the article once more and spotted the author's name, Shirley Codwell. She had been a godsend over the years, doing her research and providing actual coverage where others would not. He felt a connection with her, despite never having met or even seen her. Every year, his employers allowed him down the mountain for one day, and every year Jonas thought about trying to see her. Inevitably, he never went down the mountain at all, but it was nice to know there was the option. His heart swelling with pride, Jonas took the clipping gently and grabbed a thumbtack from the cup on the table. Looking up at the walls of his cabin, it was getting difficult to find space. Throughout his tenure on the mountain, there had been quite a few pieces, and he saved every one of them. They were all tacked to the wall behind the television, making the glowing screen feel almost like an altar. Finally, he found a spot, stood up, and pinned the article.
Thank you, Shirley.
He touched the paper one last time, savouring the fleeting connection. Reluctantly, Jonas turned off the TV, threw the dirty tumbler in the sink, and doused the lamp. The furnace clicked off on its automatic timer, and he made his way to the creaky bed that lay next to it. The intoxicating thought of real monster hunters coming to Clearwater put him at ease. He slept deeply, with dreams of legends filling his head. A Man of the Mountain, Chapter 3, Shirley. From behind her battered coffee-stained desk, Shirley more closely resembled a librarian than a journalist. Stacks of books littered her office, their titles ranging from My Encounter with the Wild Man of the Forest to Big Head, Big Hands, Big Foot. Between these accumulations of literature were equally tall piles of hand-scrawled notes. It was a stark comparison to the other offices at the local Eye, most of which were filled with photos of minor celebrities caught in risque positions and forged headlines about the second coming. While her editors had encouraged her to chase more inspiring stories, such as water stains shaped like Elvis at local dive bars, Shirley wasn't interested. While the first story about the Beast of the Mountain had been a gimmick, it quickly developed into more. Not 2 weeks after the first article had run, Shirley had covered her walls with questionable trail reports, statements from half-drunk park rangers, and blurry amateur photographs taken by passing hikers. To complete the full caricature of conspiracy, they were all connected with lines of red string. She peered over the steam of her morning coffee at the most recent headline she had crafted. It was a deep dive into yet another bear attack that had left a hiker dead. She felt a wave of anger at the indifference of the local authorities and the sheer idiocy of their explanations. Sure, the first few attacks could have been accidents. Rogue bears were uncommon, but they did exist. However, her suspicion grew after the third attack with the same bullshit explanation. Interviews revealed nothing. No one had spotted a bear or even any evidence of migration on the mountain. Still, after each attack, local authorities would say the same thing. In the past 5 years, nearly 10 hikers had died on the mountain. Just thinking about it brought on a wave of anxiety, and Shirley pulled a plastic orange medicine bottle from her drawer. The stash was supposed to be for emergencies only, but recently it felt like every day at the local Eye qualified. She shook out a pill, put it beneath her tongue and leaned back in her chair. For a while, She just stared at the dark stain on the ceiling directly above her. Sometimes, on darker days, she imagined that it was the brains of the copywriter who had come before her. Suicides were more common than resignations at the tabloid, but that was mostly because no one left. There were only 3 positions on the town's reputable paper, and the local Eye paid better as it sold more. It was an easy gig, and a simple trap to fall into. As the pill went to work, she thought back to the end of her article and the call to action she had made. Would anyone come to help? There were plenty of people who fancied themselves monster hunters, but who knew if they were the real deal? Even if they were, she doubted they'd be reading the local Eye. The clang of the old rotary phone in the next room jolted Shirley back to reality, shattering any brief sense of calm she had felt. Phone calls were rare and exciting at the local Eye. Most often they were death threats, but 1 in 10 was a solid lead. Shirley leapt up, determined to be the first one to it. She burst through the door of her office into the hallway, but another employee was already answering.
George.
She muttered his name like a curse. George was portly, balding, and picking up the receiver with an excitement he usually reserved for tinfoil hats. The phone was nearly to his ear when Shirley snatched it from his hand. Before he could protest, she answered, trying to calm herself and project journalistic integrity. George's framed "Alien Obama Stole My Colon" headline made it difficult.
Local Eye News, this is Shirley.
You the one that wrote the article about Bigfoot?
It was a man's voice, slow and dull. Questions about her work were rare. Usually, it was some hick, asking if her encounters with Bigfoot had been sexual in nature and breathing heavily.
Yes. Did you enjoy the article?
She knew full well he hadn't.
He ought to lock you up for spewing that crazy bullshit.
There was a wheezing laugh, and the line went dead. Shirley slowly lowered the phone back to the cradle, using every ounce of restraint not to smash it into 1,000 pieces.
Glad you took it instead of me.
George smiled, taking a sip from a knockoff X-Files mug that read, "Look at the skies." The town might have thought Shirley was crazy, but at least she wasn't the one voluntarily covering abductions, sightings, and casual alien encounters. Sure, the stories had gotten George tenure and an office chair that actually rolled, but she had her dignity.
You know how it is, George. Can't let them get to you.
Her tone was far calmer than she felt. Just as she was going to leave the conversation with the moral high ground, the phone rang again. Her blood boiled, making the response fast and angry. Shirley snatched up the receiver, shouting,
What?
I'm sorry. I was under the impression you were looking for help. But if you'd rather just scream at us...
Wait!
Shirley gasped with just a little too much desperation. George watched the conversation intently.
There's no need to shout. We're on a tight schedule, and we need to speak with Shirley Codwell.
Shirley wiped her brow and tried to find calm. It was like searching for a jelly bean in a ball pit.
I'm Shirley. Yes. How can I help you?
Ah, Miss Codwell. Good to meet you.
There was a pause, followed by the shuffling of papers. Then, with a deep sigh, the man continued.
Now, as I understand it, you're the one who needs our help.
The man's voice was full of the special brand of condescension held for tabloid writers. Shirley recognized it well.
As fortune would have it, one of our specials ran short, and we've got a few weeks of filler time before Rick heads into the Amazon.
Shirley barely heard the man's words.
It's really happening. After all the shit articles and side stories, I'm going to make a difference.
She thought of the headlines that would come after the famous Rick Manson killed the Beast of the Mountain and the town was safe again. She might even be able to show her face in town without getting disgusted looks.
Miss Codwell,
Yes?
Shirley was in a daze.
does that timetable work for you?
She hadn't heard a word of the timetable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for fitting us into your busy schedule.
Of course. We'll be in Clearwater with a film crew by Tuesday. You will receive a list of necessary items for the cast and crew. If one item on the list is missing, the crew turns around. Got it?
Shirley had to bite back her sarcastic instinct.
Of course. Whatever they need.
Splendid. Have a nice day.
Before she could clarify anything, the line clicked and was replaced by a dial tone. Blood was still pumping hot through Shirley's veins as she set the phone down. Tuesday was almost a week away, but one look at the filing system spread across her office floor let her know it would be a series of long nights.
Who was it?
George did little to hide his hunger for gossip. Shirley tried to remain nonchalant.
Just the History Channel. They want to do a special on the Beast of the Mountain.
With that, she turned away and walked back into her office to begin the mammoth task of reorganizing her research into a digestible format.
There's not enough coffee in the world to accomplish this.
Chapter 4. Good morning. Shirley awoke Tuesday morning to the smell of fresh coffee and sunlight streaming through her small apartment window. There were very few things that could motivate her to get out of bed, but coffee was one of them, especially when she didn't have to make it herself. After a week of preparing the exhaustive list from the History Channel, she felt like she could have slept another year and still been tired. The bedroom door opened and Lindsay strode in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Shirley swore she had never seen anything closer to an angel. The light streaming from the main room silhouetted her, completing the picture.
If I've died and gone to heaven, at least let me sleep a few more minutes.
Even in her early waking moments, Shirley had begun to worry. A nagging feeling at the back of her brain told her she was forgetting something. Likely one of the mundane items on the list she had been fulfilling for Manson. Lindsay smiled and stepped into the room.
I'd say I'm not the biblical type, but you're awake before noon on a Saturday, so clearly miracles do happen.
She moved to the edge of the bed, sat down and offered the cup to Shirley. With great effort, Shirley rose, feeling all the sore muscles in her back and legs. Shutting her eyes against the bright light, she took the cup from Lindsay's hand and felt its warmth radiate through her fingers. Slowly, she lifted it to her lips and took a sip. The feeling was electric as the hot liquid worked through her, bringing with it the precious tendrils of caffeine. There were few things that felt better than the first cup of coffee in the morning. For a few minutes, she just sat there, enjoying the sensation, feeling the warmth of the sun and Lindsay's company. It was bliss. Still, there was that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right.
What did I miss?
She reached out a hand, placed it on Lindsay's thigh, and nearly recoiled in shock at her chilled skin.
Hey, you all right? You're practically an iceberg.
Lindsay gave no response. All at once, Shirley remembered what she had forgotten.
Why is Lindsay here?
She knew the answer and shut her eyes against it, hoping that if she didn't look, it wouldn't be true.
Just stay here. Remember the sunlight. Feel the warmth.
But she remembered. She had put blackout curtains over the windows months ago. there would be no light streaming through them. And there would be no Lindsay. She opened her eyes. The edge of the bed was empty, as it always was. The bedroom door was ajar, and a pale green light was filtering through. Shirley felt a strange sensation as her legs began to move without her, propelling her out of bed and towards the light.
No. Stop this. I don't want to see this again.
She moved through the bedroom door unabated and into a stark room with metal cabinets and a row of tables down the centre. Above, a ventilation fan blew chilled air into the room, spreading the horrible sweet odour of formaldehyde. Within the vent, the fan thumped rhythmically, adding a layer of madness to the whole scene. For a minute, Shirley just stood there, in the door, looking down the long rows of metal tables, all empty, except one. Halfway down the row, a body lay covered in a white sheet. She didn't have to guess who it was.
Once was enough! I don't want to come back here!
But, as if on invisible rails, her body once more moved forward. The thumping of the fan got louder with each reluctant step. Before she knew it, she was at the centre table, grasping the edge of the sheet in her hand.
No!
The hand, no longer feeling like her hand, pulled the sheet back. Lindsay's shocked face stared up at her from the slab, terror still playing on it. The mortician hadn't been able to wipe the fear away. Some things stayed with you, even after you died. Shirley felt warm tears pour down her cheeks, and the thumping above grew louder. It was oppressive, taking up all the sound in the room, but Shirley barely heard it. Her eyes were locked with Lindsay's, experiencing the whole thing over again.
Why the hell did it have to be her?
From the far end of the room, Shirley saw a blur of motion at the corner of her eye. The fan grew louder, rising like a bass drum in a marching band. She looked up, only for a split second, and saw it. The creature was easily 10 feet tall, covered head to foot in dark brown fur. Long claws hung down at its sides, dripping blood onto the sterilised floor. Its head was tilted slightly in interest. Slowly, its lips curled back, revealing a set of thick, pointed teeth. It let out a roar, shaking her very bones. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. The creature rushed her, its footfalls pounding in time with the fan, shaking Lindsay's table. Shirley was frozen, staring at the oncoming attack, knowing there was nothing that could be done. 15 feet away, 5 feet away. Shirley awoke with a start, leaping from her bed. Her body was slick with sweat, and her heart was pounding so hard that she feared it might burst from her chest. Her vision was blurred, but she recognised her apartment and felt the tension in her back and shoulders begin to ease ever so slightly. She was back in her bedroom, but other than a sliver of light peeking out from behind the blackout curtains, it was dark. Taking a deep breath, Shirley willed herself to calm. It was a difficult process, but over the years, she had many opportunities to practice. The noise from the dream came again, only faster, and Shirley nearly jumped out of her skin.
Miss Codwell? Are you in there?
Called someone from the other side of the apartment's main door. Shirley turned to her clock, saw that it was nearly 10 a.m, and felt a new sense of terror flood her.
Shit! Shit, shit, shit!
She looked around desperately for a pair of pants.
Be right there!
Miss Codwell, this is completely unacceptable. Preparations for Dr. Manson's arrival...
Shirley stopped listening. She couldn't tell for sure, but it sounded like the same dolt she had spoken to on the phone previously. Half running, half hopping, she pulled up a pair of jeans that were far tighter than she wanted them to be and made it to the door. Giving her hair a quick comb through with her fingers, she took a deep breath and opened it. The man on the other side was small, mousy, and clearly aggravated. His fist was held mid-knock, knuckle pointed to Shirley. He lowered it to his side sheepishly, but his face remained beet red. Shirley's heart rate had slowed to a dull thud, but she could still feel the lingering sickness from her dream pulsating through her. It always stuck around.
Well?
She willed herself to be pissed off at being woken, rather than depressed. She put a hand on one hip to solidify the image. The man looked stunned, unsure of what to say.
Dr. Manson will be here in less than a few hours. Do you have all the items we requested?
Shirley rolled her eyes.
Yes. You made it very clear that he wouldn't show up without him. Although what he's going to do with a taxidermied rabbit is a question I really don't want the answer to.
He didn't request...
Relax. Let's take a trip to the forestry center and I can show you what we have set up. But first, I'm going to need a strong cup of coffee.
Chapter 5. The Falls. The sound of gnashing metal blades filled Jonas's cabin as he ground the beans for his afternoon cup of coffee. It had been a long and uneventful week. Each night the snows had been heavier than the last, leaving him to shovel a path out of the cabin each day, just so he could keep track of where it was. The trail he travelled was very specific, and missteps couldn't be afforded. It was hard work, but the weather kept hikers away, leaving Jonas completely alone on the mountain, just the way he liked it. Though his excursions were difficult in the more extreme weather, the solitude had allowed him to travel farther down the mountain than normal without being noticed. On the nights he was able to get out, he roamed as far as the lower family trails, leaving samples and marks everywhere he could. The storms would likely blow away all his hard work, but even for the slightest chance, the effort was worth it. He knew that the heavy snows wouldn't last much longer. The temperature still stayed well below freezing most of the time, but winter was clearly in its final push before spring. Not long after that, people would arrive. As the days grew longer, hikers grew more adventurous, meaning he would have to be extra careful. There were always more accidents during spring and summer. He shook off the thought and poured coffee into a plain brown mug that read, "Protect our National Parks." Outside, the shadows were beginning to grow long. The mountain was clearly in between two storm fronts, leaving clear skies for the rest of the day and into the evening. With the weather breaking, Jonas knew he would have to head out soon. His body ached from shoveling, but there was no getting around it. He had to use the opportunities he was afforded. A nagging feeling began to tug at the nerves behind his temples. It happened every time a piece was published. While he had tried not to get his hopes up, the lack of response to the article in the local Eye was disheartening. Rick Manson still hadn't announced where he was going next, but Jonas now believed it was anywhere but Clearwater. The thought of it made him want to stay in the cabin and drown his sorrows, but the weather was fair and he had a job to do. As he passed the kitchen to deposit his coffee mug, he spied the cabinet that concealed his last bottle of whiskey. He passed it reluctantly, knowing that the mountain was dangerous enough without it. A twinge of nostalgia and darkness played in the back of his mind as he double-checked his supplies. He was thankful for it, as it pushed the nagging self-resentment away. This particular darkness had a clearly identifiable source, and Jonas knew the solution to ease it. He put on his snowshoes and opened the cabin door into the blinding afternoon light. White mounds of snow came up to his hips on either side. Ahead, he He could see the results of his hard work in the form of a small trench leading into the forest. Above, the sky had just begun to tint with orange as the sun made its way towards the horizon.
If I hurry, I can make it before sunset.
With renewed resolve, Jonas set out towards one of his favourite places on the mountain. Clearwater Mountain, another clever name for a local landmark, was now snow-capped in the winter, but melted almost entirely during the summer, giving way to a series of massive waterfalls fed by the glacier just below the summit. Fields of flowers spread out beneath, giving a spectacular and picturesque appearance for visiting tourists. Unlike most, Jonas preferred the winter form. As the mountain grew cold, the falls would freeze, turning sparkling blue and sending jagged spikes of ice tumbling down to a great snowy field below. The spot held a special significance for him, and on days when he thought he might give up the job altogether, he would make the climb. To get to the top of the falls was no easy feat for everyday hikers, but even with a little climbing experience, it was a quick ascent. To the right side of the base was a rock chute, narrow and easily scalable with the right equipment and skill. At the edge of the main trails, Jonas donned his gear. Climbing would be more difficult in the suit, but he couldn't risk being seen. He looked up at the deepening red in the sky and hurried through the deep powder towards the base, grunting and howling. The sound echoed off the falls and reverberated 100 times back across the field. It was intimidating, even to him. He reached the bottom of the chute and looked up. A series of handholds were still in place from the last climbing season and looked stable. There was a stash of rope in a crevice nearby, but Jonas had always preferred to go without it. Taking away the lifeline made him careful and reminded him just how close the other side could be. Hand over hand, he began to climb. He had made the ascent dozens of times, and before long was clambering over the top onto the hard-packed ice. His arms burned, but he was otherwise unscathed, having arrived just in time to see the sunset. Further down the mountain was a viewing platform with coin-operated binoculars for those who didn't want to make the climb. Jonas had purposefully scuffed all the lenses long ago to ensure that no one would ever get a clear look at him. There had been a few grainy photographs taken by amateurs, but no one wanted to believe, making them easily dismissed. Silhouetted atop the falls, Jonas stepped to the edge and let out his mightiest roar, beating his chest with his hands. It would have been a fear-inspiring image, but as he suspected, the viewing platform was empty. On the horizon, churning clouds signalled the beginning of yet another storm. The sun cast them in sharp relief, painting the image of what was to come. The world descended into a hazy twilight as the last light went out of the day. A bitter wind blew across the top of the falls, sending tiny motes of crystalline ice skittering across. Even through the suit, Jonas could feel the chill. He walked to the edge of the falls and sat down. Thousands upon thousands of frosted white pine trees stared back at him, keeping sentinel on the slopes below. He thought of the hiker from the week before, and his stomach did a slight turn. It seemed he had come to the falls for more than one reason. The view was beautiful, but also held history. He stood and walked away from the ledge, following the curvature of the ice towards a steep ascent to the summit beyond. He didn't need to go far. Standing still, same as the day he had placed them, were 3 large stones heaped into a pile. To the passer-by, the sight wouldn't appear intentional, but Jonas would always be able to find it. He stared at the stones, remembering the man he was before and after he had placed them. So much had changed in a matter of a few seconds. His first year had passed without incident, but as with most fatal encounters, he was overconfident and miscalculated. The famous Clearwater Falls were pictured on promotional material at every rest stop for miles, and he had wanted to get a look for himself. It was late into the summer, and most of the crowds had left the mountains. In short, it was the perfect time. But one climber had decided to make a final summit bid before fall. Jonas had set out from his cabin in the late afternoon, walking strictly in the brush, barely visible from any of the main trails. He had been so careful, even picking his way across the flower fields. He had kept low and listened for hikers. All signs pointed to the perfect evening, an empty mountain and a beautiful sunset to top it off. He reached the chute without incident and climbed. It was at the top of the chute that he made his critical mistake. Rather than waiting to check, he had simply popped right out with no effort towards concealment. That's when he saw her. The sight must have been comical at first, a man clearly masquerading as a furry mess climbing out of the crag. What little humour there was passed quickly. The joy of climbing the falls turned to ash and settled in his throat. The climber had seen him, and there was no room for negotiation on what had to happen next. His employers had made sure of that. For the first time, he felt the weight of the blades concealed in his gloves. In that moment, Jonas learned what it was like to become a killer. There was no choice in the matter, only bitter certainty. He wanted to turn around, to run, but knew it would be no use. Leaving a loose end behind would make him a liability and end his tenure on the mountain. Beyond that, he sensed a part of him that wanted to stay. In that moment, he wasn't Jonas. He was a beast of legend, staring down prey. The climber hesitated, frozen in the red glow of the setting sun. For a minute, neither of them moved. Then, throwing caution to the wind, she ran directly at him. The only route down was through the chute, and Jonas was standing right at the top of it. He panicked and swung hard right as she passed him. There was a horrifying, tugging sensation as his claws found their mark. Then just as quickly, they were free. 3 red streaks splattered the grey rock. The hiker continued to run, stumbling and grabbing at her chest. Jonas reached out to stop her, but she went right over the edge of the falls, plummeting to the field below. For a moment, he could do nothing but stand there, watching gravity do its work. Seconds passed like hours, and eventually he heard a sound that he would never forget. As she struck the rocks below. I need to move. Most of the tourists were gone, but if anyone had been on the viewing platform, the climber's dive would have been hard to miss. The journey back down was difficult, and he nearly fell several times due to the numbing sensation in his fingertips. All he could think of was a look of surprise on her face as his claws cut deep. He continued to move, knowing that every second he wasted could mean his freedom or his life. Jonas had stayed in the cabin for days, waiting for the banging of local authorities on his door. But time passed and no one came. Eventually he received a small package with a note and a rolled up newspaper. While it could not lift his spirits completely, the tabloid headline featuring "Bigfoot strikes on Clearwater Mountain" roused something inside of him. In that moment, he was alive. Maybe more alive than he had ever been. The night after receiving the headline, Jonas had gone back to the top of the chute and erected his memorial. Ever since the accident, most people had avoided the summit. Most of them didn't believe a legend had done it, but they weren't willing to risk it either. Looking down at the stones, he could not believe how much had changed. Years had passed, more had died, but the legend had grown. Fuck it, he said to the wind. Even if monster hunters didn't come this time, they might the next. He wasn't going to give up on the only thing that gave him purpose so easily. Bending down, he let his gloved hand run over the stones, remembering that night. Eventually, he turned around and walked back towards the edge. As he descended, he left several samples of fur, wedging them in the crags. Most of the time, climbers were too busy to notice them, but there was always a chance someone would get curious. When he reached the bottom, it was nearly full dark and a pale moon had risen into the sky, causing the frosted layer on the field below to twinkle like an ocean of stars. Jonas looked over it, admiring the beauty. His heart skipped a beat. At the edge of the clearing was a blinking red dot. Jonas's reaction was immediate.
You imbeciles and your fucking cameras!
Without a moment's hesitation, he charged, heart racing in his chest with each thundering step. The light was not moving. Huge plumes of snow kicked up in the field behind him.
Fucker isn't even recording from a good angle.
As he got closer, he noticed something odd. There was no hiker. A wave of relief hit him, followed by a greater wave of excitement. The blinking light was attached to a tree. He approached and saw a small yellow pyramid with a microphone mounted in the middle. Jonas pried it from the bark with ease and couldn't help but grin like an idiot when he saw the label. Painted in bold black letters was "Property of the History Channel. Do not remove." Chapter 6. The Greatest Showman.
The small town of Clearwater, destination for local hikers and home of the famous Clearwater Falls, is under attack.
Rick Manson strode over to prop himself up against a small wood structure with maps of the mountain's hiking trails framed on it.
10 deaths in the last 5 years, all explained away as bear attacks.
He cocked an eyebrow at the camera, sharing a "we know better" moment with the viewers at home. A man sitting behind a mounted camera gave him the thumbs up. He pointed to another operator and held up 2 fingers. In an almost Pavlovian response, Manson turned to camera 2 and smiled broadly.
Gigantopithecus, or Bigfoot as most of us know it, has long been rumoured to be in the area. It was seen from the missing hikers that he's been quite troublesome.
A man in a cheap suit with a ball cap labelled "Director" held up a white sign that read "Pause for laughs." Manson took a deep breath as if composing himself and made a sweeping gesture towards the map behind him. There was a loud clunk as Rick smacked his hand into it.
God damn it!
He shouted, shaking his hand to get the pain out.
Fucking camping grounds!
Manson's face had grown red.
Are we 12? Do people even fucking camp anymore?
The cast and crew remained silent.
Still rolling,
said the director. It wasn't the first time Manson broke script to bitch, and it wouldn't be the last. Manson slapped himself in the face lightly and turned back to the camera, rage instantly fading, at least on the surface.
Over the following week, we're going to be tracking the Beast of Clearwater Mountain. And when we find it...
He trailed off, letting the implications set in.
Let's just say the citizens of Clearwater can rest easy, because Manson's Mysteries is on the case. Be sure to tune in 8 p.m. this Sunday as we begin our search.
Manson looked intimately into the camera and held what he hoped would be the audience's gaze.
And cut. Great stuff, Rick. Real magic.
Rick's plastic smile melted away faster than spring snow.
Remind me to fire the intern that answered a letter from this goddamn backwater.
Rick stormed off to a set of trailers that had been double parked in the Forestry Service's visitor spaces.
Backwaters make for good ratings,
called the director after him. He had worked with Manson for years and, as a result, was an expert in the art of placation. Manson slammed the door to his trailer so hard that the plastic plaque bearing his name went tumbling into the dirt.
Prima donna. All right, everyone, that's lunch. Try not to get food poisoning at the local trough.
The various cast and crew shuffled away, questioning their career choices. Meanwhile, Manson fumed in his trailer about the 2 weeks he would be spending in Clearwater. It was a short shoot by all standards, but God forbid if it actually got ratings. They might have to extend their stay. He let out a melodramatic sigh and sat down in a chair in front of a well-lit mirror. In the reflection, he could see the cases and frames that had been bolted to nearly every wall. Many had said it was structurally unsafe, but looking at all the television awards, as well as his degree, brought him a sense of purpose. Rick Manson, doctorate in cryptozoology, Harvard, he murmured, in awe of himself. ignoring the exclamation point after Harvard. Next to the degree and above his sink was a perfectly polished People's Choice Award next to an empty Emmy case he pretended not to notice. Even slumming the backwaters of North America was worth it if there was a chance to add to his collection. He remained there for a full minute, completely absorbed in himself and unaware of the fact that he was not alone. Sitting in a chair that folded out of the back wall, below a printout of Manson's Mysteries 2004 ratings, was Shirley. She held a stack of papers that had been loosely bound together by a series of thick rubber bands and what appeared to be a man's belt. She coughed in meek gesture of politeness. Rick jumped so high that he nearly hit the ceiling and sent a cup full of combs crashing to the floor.
Jesus Christ! Who are you? And what do you want from me?
Manson backed away slowly, as if dealing with a wild animal.
We have an autograph session set for Thursday. Can it not wait?
His eyes darted to the trailer door, and he inched towards it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you.
Stammered Shirley, standing from her chair and inadvertently blocking the exit.
Look, I'll sign it.
Manson pulled the Sharpie from his jacket pocket and held it pointed like a lance.
Just, please, don't do anything rash.
He uncapped the pen, reached out a shaking hand and scribed a signature on the outside of a trail report in Shirley's stack.
Oh, no, I'm not a fan. I'm Shirley Codwell, the one who wrote the letter.
Manson stood there, heart still pounding, trying to think if that was a name he should have remembered.
The letter?
He managed eventually.
Yes, about the attacks on the mountain.
The fear left him and was replaced by the same petulant rage that had filled him earlier.
Well, Miss Codwell, who exactly was it that let you in here?
No longer threatened, Manson had returned to overwhelming bravado, with his chest puffed out in a cartoonish display of superiority. Shirley's face had grown bright red. She had expected things to go much differently.
I'm so sorry. It was one of your production assistants. He said you would want to see the files yourself.
She held up a stack of papers that now bore Manson's signature. They had taken her a full week to organise and repair. Some were still stained with gin and God knows what from late-night research sessions, but they looked far better than they had scattered across her office floor.
Yes.
Manson eyed the stack of papers with more contempt than embarrassment.
Give him here, then.
He snatched the dossier from her hand and walked over to a radio mounted to the far wall.
Herb, fire whoever let Miss Codwell into my trailer and send in their replacement. I've got some research for them to look at.
Shirley tried unsuccessfully to hide her disappointment. All her work will be tossed aside for an intern. Struggling, she started again.
Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Manson. It means a lot that someone is finally going to take these attacks seriously.
Hi, Hillary. It's Rick.
Rick had picked up a mobile phone and began talking.
Yeah, I'm in town for a few days shooting a special. Want to meet me for drinks?
Rick glanced over at Shirley and nearly jumped again, surprised she was still there. He pointed to the dossier, gave her a thumbs up, and then made a shooing motion towards the door. Shirley felt rage bubbling up from inside her, but kept it down, thinking that any coverage was better than no coverage. She left the trailer, hoping that somehow, despite appearances, Manson's presence would help. Manson continued his call, barely aware that Shirley had left, and already forgetting she had been there in the first place.
Nah. We're not actually going to go up the mountain. That's not how it works. We'll just shoot a few promos around the base, do a little light hiking, and record some scary noises at night. It'll remain a mystery. And if viewers like it, we'll come back next season.
Chapter 7. Obsession.
The small town of Clearwater, destination for local hikers and home of the famous Clearwater Falls, is under attack.
Jonas couldn't contain himself. He sat on the edge of his chair, watching Manson's Mysteries as the camera panned up to reveal the man himself standing in front of Clearwater Mountain.
10 deaths in the last 5 years, all explained away as bear attacks.
Chills ran up and down his spine. He had hoped one day Rick would be this close, but a part of him never believed it. He finally came.
Gigantopithecus, or Bigfoot as most of us know it, has long been rumoured to be in the area. It was seen from the missing hikers that he's been quite troublesome.
Jonas wanted to reach out and touch the television, but resisted the urge. On the walls, Shirley's articles glowed in the firelight. It was all worth it. He was finally going to get his chance. He stood to run his hands across the first article she had written. It was a simple opinion piece about the wild man at sunset, but it had kicked off so much more.
Over the following week, we're going to be tracking the Beast of Clearwater Mountain.
Jonas snapped back to reality, nearly losing his balance as Manson mentioned the Beast of the Mountain. Hearing his title on Manson's mysteries was almost too much.
And when we find it, let's just say the citizens of Clearwater can rest easy. We've already begun tracking the beast movement using state-of-the-art technology provided by our generous sponsors.
Rick winked at the camera and held up a small yellow pyramid.
They record video and audio, which, when put together, functions as a sonar web.
Rick augmented the last two words with air quotes.
Or at least that's what the scientists tell me. I'm just here to kill the damn thing.
Jonas felt the grin spread across his face. You can certainly try.
Be sure to tune in 8 p.m. this Sunday as we begin our search, because Manson's Mysteries is on the case.
This was it, the moment he had been waiting years for. He wouldn't be preying on defenseless hikers, but instead testing himself against the real item, a bona fide monster hunter. Jonas walked to the kitchen and poured himself a celebratory drink. There was still a twinge in his temples from the last celebration as the good news continued to come. The usually dim cabin felt warm and alive with excitement. In the other room, Manson continued to talk about the techniques they would use to kill him. Jonas took a sip from the well-worn cup. He knew exactly how Manson's team would attack the problem and how to exploit their weakness. He had watched every episode of Manson's Mysteries, and their approach never changed. They would spend the bulk of their time filming out of harm's way, drawing out the suspense. Then, just before the shoot ended, they would strike. The crew would be armed. They never showed it on the program, but there was no way the History Channel was letting Manson take pot shots at deadly beasts without backup. The promo ended, and Jonas felt his heart race. There was work to be done. If he was going to stand any chance at defeating Manson, he would have to lure him into a one-on-one setting, away from his crew. The falls stood out as the obvious choice. They were pristine, beautiful, and already held significance for him. The fight would be quick and messy, but Jonas's mind spun with every possible outcome. Somewhere around the 60th scenario and nearly an hour of pacing, a thought came to him. He stopped in front of the wall of newspaper clippings, looked up at them with pride and, for the first time, sorrow. I need to see Shirley. The thought itself was not new, but a part of him knew it might be his last chance. A Man of the Mountain. Chapter 8. The Busy Bee Diner. Shirley sat at the counter of a local chain diner, sipping a cup of watery coffee. It wasn't nearly as good as the stuff she brewed at home, but after around 4 cups, she found she could get a twinge of motivation, if not a kick. Her hands shook, partly from the lack of sleep, partly from the rage induced by the full-grown toddler that was Rick Manson. In all her years at the tabloid, she had never witnessed such a parade of idiocy, and that was saying something. At least when George brought a UFO convention to town, they believed in what they were selling. Manson was just a ratings whore, hiding beneath a paper-thin shell of false bravado. Shirley drained what was left in the coffee cup and set it down in front of her with a little too much force. The waitress, dressed in a laughable black and yellow striped uniform, looked up from her magazine and set it down. She grabbed the coffee pot with practiced lethargy and meandered over to pour Shirley her 5th cup. Begrudgingly, The waitress filled Shirley's mug, hesitated, and then asked,
Would you like to order food now?
Shirley said nothing, choosing instead to sip the coffee loudly until the waitress returned to her post. There was no point in muddying the caffeine with diner food. A plate of the Busy Bee's eggs and toast, fried in a pint of butter, was more apt to giving her a heart attack than the inspiration she needed. Through the haze of stress and exhaustion, Shirley had to laugh as the waitress sighed and slumped away in her cutesy uniform.
Must be the world's most apathetic bumblebee.
Pain throbbed in her temples. It seemed that all the coffee in the world couldn't rid her of the current predicament. For the first few days, she had tried showing up on set, guiding Manson through her research, but quickly realised it was pointless. The only chance Manson's team stood of killing the beast was if it was somehow allergic to autographs. All the footage from the upper mountain was shot from hidden vantage points by interns or automatic cameras. So far, they hadn't seen anything. Rick, meanwhile, had stuck to the kids' trails, never travelling more than a few hundred feet away from his trailer. It seemed that every day he was out gallivanting on the lower trails, finding nothing but pre-placed evidence his crew had laid out for him. The segments had been so scripted that Shirley had to force herself not to gag. After a full week, they were no closer to finding the beast. And while the town loved the publicity, Shirley's credibility at the tabloid had somehow sunk lower. She sighed and laid her head down on the cool countertop, hoping to ease her aching brain. From her new sideways perspective, Shirley noticed something odd. A man reading a newspaper had just peeked over the edge at her and ducked quickly out of sight. She raised her head to get a better look, and the man raised his paper to obscure himself further.
The weirdos in this town.
She thought, ignoring the vial of Sasquatch hair around her neck. She lifted her head and continued the search for optimism at the bottom of her coffee mug.
He has to go up the mountain at some point. It's impossible for them to shoot everything down here.
She doubted that Rick would have any idea what to do with the monster when he found it, but that would serve him right. A chill crept up her spine as she spotted the man peeking over his paper at her again. There was something off about him, and her heart beat loudly in her chest.
Calm down. It's just another asshole. Probably just wants to tell you you're crazy.
Once more, she tried to distract herself with schemes of getting Rick to do his job.
There's only one way. I have to play his ego.
Shirley tousled her hair up a bit, wondering briefly if seducing him was an option. The thought alone nearly killed her, and she immediately nixed it. Out of the corner of her eye, she spied movement. Glancing sideways, she saw the man with the newspaper had moved to a bar stool not 5 feet away.
Can I help you?
The man peeked over the newspaper. He had awkward eyes, but there was a strange confidence behind them. He quickly lifted his paper once more, as if somehow maintaining the image of stealth.
Look, if you're going to insult me over some long-forgotten article, get it over with. I've had a long day.
Sorry, I was still thinking of an answer to your first question, he said, without lowering the newspaper.
My first question?
Can I help you?
Look, pal.
You see, I thought I was here to help you, but I'm not the one to turn down a favour. He shuffled the newspaper and clucked his tongue.
Well, I'm doing quite fine. Thanks.
Shirley pulled a $5 bill out of her wallet, trying not to notice that it was her last, and set it down on the counter.
The coffee isn't even good. Why do I keep coming here?
She got up from her stool and began to walk away. The man lowered the newspaper to gloat. Oh, really? Then Manson has killed the beast. Amazing. I really didn't think he had it in him. I once saw him struggle to put down a vampiric gerbil, but glad he's found his stride after 20 years. There was a slight hiccup from the man as he put the newspaper on the counter. Shirley sat back down in stunned silence. You see, I was under the impression that Rick never films anywhere near danger and prefers to make his underlings do it instead. In fact, I don't think he has any intention of going up the mountain at all. The man smiled broadly, as if he had just figured out some complex puzzle and wasn't shouting conspiracy theories in a rural diner. Shirley's brain was telling her legs to move forward, but the drunk wasn't wrong.
I was starting to think the same thing.
The man was strange, but didn't seem dangerous. All the same, her hand dropped to her side pocket where a small tube of mace was clipped. The man glanced nervously down at her hand, not missing the implication, but brushed it off. "Hi, I'm Nick Ventnor, a proper monster hunter, and nothing like those arsats at the History Channel." Nick extended his hand. Shirley surprised herself by moving her hand away from the mace to shake his. The only other person in the bar, a man in a baseball cap and camo jacket, stood up from his booth and left cursing. "This whole damn town has gone fucking crazy." Piss off and open your mind a bit." Nick held up a middle finger to the man who was already slamming the diner's door.
That was probably more for me,
said Shirley, embarrassed. It wasn't the first time she had been cursed out in a diner. In fact, it would make the third time at the Busy Bee in 6 months. Because of the column, Nick picked up Shirley's coffee cup, sniffed it, put it down, and pulled out a flask instead. "Well, they're only half wrong," Nick said between sizable gulps.
Excuse me?
The tension that had left her fingers renewed. Don't take offence. There are flaws in everyone's research." Seeing that he was once again close to getting attacked, Nick course-corrected. "The really important thing is that you're asking questions, even if you're making the wrong conclusions. It's delightful to have an inquisitive mind." He smiled, as if this smoothed things over. Shirley's face fell halfway between a grimace and a grin. She was still feeling a little on edge, but at least he had read her articles. That was more prep work than Manson by a mile.
You're not great with people, are you?
Nick looked shocked. "Of course I am. I just speak my mind and speak it plainly. There's no point in wasting our valuable time. There are any number of shadow organisations that could want us, well, me, dead at any moment. Life is short." He rummaged through his bag and pulled out a newspaper clipping. "Look, you tabloid writers are often the only people willing to talk about something for what it really is." He slid the article over to Shirley. It was a press clipping concerning Manson's most recent excursions in New Mexico, where he had taken care of a chupacabra problem in the area. The story went on to say that Manson had done nothing but booze around the town and occasionally filmed promos for the entirety of the 3 weeks he had been there. In the end, the author claimed that the child had been rescued on camera when he was actually drugged by a member of Manson's team and planted for a better story.
That's despicable.
A few days earlier, she might not have believed it, but after a week in Manson's company, it was downright plausible. "See? Never mind that they got all their chupacabra facts wrong."
That's what bothers you?
Nick tugged at his collar uncomfortably. "Anyways, point is, Manson is a fraud. If you want that Sasquatch off your mountain, I'm your man."
So you're going to help?
"Well, that depends."
Depends on what?
Asked Shirley, full well knowing the answer. "How much are you willing to pay?"
People are dying.
"People are dying everywhere. What makes Clearwater so special?" A flicker of regret crossed his face, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared.
There's no money in it.
Nick stood up from his stool at the bar. "Well, this has been a waste. Next time you put out an ad, maybe label it as charity." He turned to leave.
But there's a high chance of humiliating Manson.
Shirley didn't know much about Nick, but could clearly sense his rivalry. Nick stopped in his tracks. "Humiliation, while tempting, won't fill this flask." He shook the now empty metal container.
There'd also be considerable notoriety for taking down the Beast of the Mountain. If he actually finds it, that might be true.
History Channel and their clever fucking names. Nick huffed, but did not continue to leave. There was silence between them for a moment. The waitress, who had been managing the register the whole time, finally lost it.
Will you two take your batshit conversation out of my diner?
Nick looked at the woman dumbfounded. "If we can't have batshit conversations in diners, where can we have them?" The waitress faltered, trying to process the question.
This happens a lot. It definitely isn't her diner, but she will call the cops, and that's more hassle than I need right now.
She picked up her bag and walked away from the counter. Nick took a last look at the waitress and said, "Your coffee is shit, by the way." He then trotted after Shirley. Outside, the sky was the brilliant blue of springtime. Shirley rubbed her eyes, surprised by the brightness.
Why does anyone even eat here?
It's the only diner in town, and most people don't talk about killing mythical creatures in it.
Despite the early nature of the day, Shirley felt exhausted. She now had 2 monster hunters in town, neither of which were going to provide any help.
The next bus out of town is at noon. You should catch it.
Nick stiffened.
I drove here.
Shirley looked him up and down.
Really? Look more the drifter type.
Nick smoothed the wrinkles in his clothes and tried to wipe any perceivable grime from them.
All right, fine. I'll do it. But you're going to need to provide for my expenses.
I can barely pay my own rent.
Fine. You'll provide a bottle of top-shelf booze.
Shirley remained silent.
Middle shelf.
Still silence.
Fine. Bottom shelf. But it has to be a handle.
Nick stuck out his hand as if that settled the matter. Shirley rolled her eyes and shook it.
You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Vettner.
Splendid. Let's go get that handle. Then we can pay a visit to my dear friend Rick.
How do you know him?
We went to school together. If he's anything like he used to be, it'll be easy to goad him into doing something really stupid.
Chapter 9. Something really stupid. The set was not far from the liquor store, Nick's first priority. He had barely waited for the car to stop in the forestry centre parking lot before hopping out to look for Manson. Almost immediately, he spotted a massive trailer and went straight for it, moving like a hungry dog. Without hesitation, he marched through the door like he owned the damn thing. Shirley hurried behind, exchanging nervous glances with many of the production crew. Luckily, none of them seemed too keen to act on the intruder and were instead content just to gawp. She ran to catch up to Nick, not wanting to miss what was sure to be a spectacular confrontation.
Hello, Rick.
There was a loud sound of a pistol cocking.
Oh shit.
Shirley quickened her pace, hoping that she had not just aided and abetted a murder. Luckily, Nick walked out of the trailer looking crestfallen, holstering his weapon.
He's not even here.
Nick spun around like a needle on a compass trying to find north, jittering wildly and stopping suddenly. He was about to jog off in the direction of a scrawny man wearing a production assistant t-shirt when Shirley stepped in front of him.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
Trying to find Manson.
Nick pointed a shaking finger at the PA.
And I think that little weasel knows where he is.
I meant with the gun, you imbecile.
Oh!
Nick pulled out the gun once more. Shirley flinched away reflexively.
Relax. It isn't even loaded.
Nick popped out the magazine, never letting his eyes drop from the PA. He was like a predator stalking in the wild. Shirley took the magazine and examined it. Satisfied that it was indeed empty, she handed it back.
You're going to get yourself killed.
Maybe.
The production assistant had noted Nick's interest and was beginning to back away.
Half this town has carrying permits and wouldn't mind putting some loudmouth stranger in there.
Oh, no you don't.
The production assistant began to run. Nick took off after him.
God damn it.
Shirley followed close behind. Nick caught up to the boy with ease and grabbed him by the collar.
Hi there. I'm looking for Rick.
I'm sorry, sir. Only the cast is supposed to know where we're shooting.
The poor kid was visibly shaking. Nick didn't miss a step.
And who the hell do you think I am?
The boy looked at him, confused.
I'm cast, you nitwit. Name's Nick Ventnor. I'm a consultant the network hired for the final push here.
Nick took his free hand and smoothed over his hair.
They wanted to make it grittier, so they brought me in.
Shirley caught up to them.
And this is Shirley. She's the one that gave you the tip to come here in the first place.
The PA continued to shake in silence.
Well, show some respect.
Hello?
Shirley mouthed, sorry.
Now, what do you think they would do to a producer?
Nick stopped, as if noticing the boy's t-shirt for the first time. "Excuse me, production assistant. I didn't let their guests on set." The PA grimaced, as if under extreme mental anguish. After what felt like hours of this internal calculation, he gave in.
They're on one of the lower hiking trails by Clearwater Lake.
He exhaled with such relief that it closely resembled a volcanic fissure. "Really? Clearwater Lake. On Clearwater Mountain. In Clearwater." Nick tightened his grip. "Just how stupid do you think I am?"
It's real, Nimrod.
Shirley gave Nick a hard shove and he lost his grip on the PA.
The settlers just weren't much for words.
She turned her head to the PA, who was still cowering.
What are you doing? Run!
Nick brushed himself off. "That," he pointed to the PA, "is why I never travel with assistants." Shirley shrugged.
He held out longer than I would have expected. Trailhead for the lake is right there.
She pointed to a wooden sign reading Clearwater Lake Trail with a painted smiley face beneath it, signifying an easy hike. "Fantastic!" Nick strode off towards the trail with a clear sense of purpose. The lake trail was flanked on either side by tall trees that blotted out most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a cool twilight. Shirley thought about the days when she used to go out on the mountain for fun. On her first summer returning from college, she had spent all her time exploring the forest surrounding Clearwater. That was almost 10 years ago, back when a journalism degree still held more promise than a position writing for the local Eye.
How the hell did I end up here?
A pang of nostalgia for that old hopefulness hit her as she looked at the trail. She consoled herself.
At least it's exciting.
Shirley savoured the calm moments as they walked. Aside from Nick mumbling to himself about Sasquatch migration patterns and occasional cursing, it was quiet. It was likely the last time the trails would be so empty for a while. The fame of a television special was sure to destroy the town for a year or two. Shops would open, selling t-shirts and off-brand merchandise. Tourists would flock for a few years and then slowly discover the very shallow bottom of Clearwater's offerings. It was a shame, but if it stopped the attacks, then it was worth it. After 15 minutes of walking, they emerged into a clearing where several towering lights had been erected. A cadre of makeup artists, assistants and crew bustled about. Standing smug in the middle of the vortex was Manson, recording corny lines from a yellowing sheet of paper. He looked up, just in time to see them coming out of the trees. Even through the painted-on tan, his face went pale at the sight of Nick. Almost immediately, he dropped the script and ran.
"Oh, come on, Rick. Is that any way to treat an old friend?"
Nick's tone was jovial, but he had once again taken chase. There was an odd hunger in his eyes. The cast and crew stopped what they were doing to stare at the commotion, thankful for any opportunity to get away from the script. Unfortunately for them, the chase lasted all of 30 seconds. Manson may have looked the part of an explorer, but he was well out of shape. Nick tackled him into the dirt and pinned his arms with ease. Shirley hurried over for a closer look.
"Someone get this madman off of me!"
Manson was struggling hard, but succeeding in nothing but driving himself further into the dirt. "Don't fight it now. Say the words and this can all be over. You know the rules."
"I will..."
Manson's protestation was cut off by Nick shoving his face in the dirt. When he let him back up, his voice was weaker.
"This is humiliating. Come on, Nick."
"That's the intention. Now, you signed your name same as everyone else. You know the rules." There wasn't any malice in Nick's voice, but it was clear he wouldn't be letting up. Manson struggled, but eventually redness flushed his cheeks and the fight went out of him.
"You have bested me and are far superior in every way."
"You put up a good fight." The words came out rehearsed. From Shirley's point of view, Manson hadn't even put up a good run, much less a fight. Manson got to his feet, brushing himself off and trying to regain his demanding composure.
"Now that you've finished assaulting me, what the hell are you doing on my set?"
"Call it professional courtesy." Nick began a leisurely stroll around the production area.
"And I suppose she was the one to call you?"
Manson motioned to Shirley like an irksome fly.
She called both of you. Mr. Ventnor over...
"Call me Nick."
Stop interrupting me and I might! Mr. Ventnor answered the same ad you did, but unlike you, it seems he is actually going to try and kill the beast.
And what do you suppose we're doing here?
Getting some good establishing shots to set up a cliffhanger for a season you'll film next year?
That's absolutely preposterous.
How did you plan on killing it without ever stepping off the main hiking trails?
We have every intention of...
Let's see. Nick looked at the sun, checking its position. You're on day 7 of shooting. It's almost 3 o'clock, and you never stay anywhere more than a week and a half if you can help it. Nick walked over to a small tent, split open the canvas with his knife, and began rummaging around inside. Shirley, how long does it take to summit Clearwater Mountain?
At least a day, and that's if you have the experience.
She looked the crew over and couldn't help but laugh. They looked like they'd have trouble with the rock ball at the local gym. Manson tried to protest, realizing the trap that was being laid for him, but Nick crashed ahead. He emerged from the tent with empty hands. What do you know? No climbing gear. Shirley faked a look of shock and surprise. Seeing Manson humiliated in front of his entire crew was bringing her a surprising amount of joy.
If you are quite...
By my mark, that means you should be heading up the mountain tomorrow. That is, if you had any intention at all of going up there in the first place.
If you're implying
that you're a fraud and couldn't kill the beast with the holy sword that pierced Christ himself? Nick paused, scanning the crew to ensure they were watching. Yes, that is my implication. Don't miss it. Manson's fury roared back to the surface, his thin veneer of resolve melting like summer snow.
Jealousy does not become you, Nick. We run a business here, and to keep it running, we have to get certain ratings. No one is going to watch a segment about me hiking up a mountain for a day and a half.
A smug smile crossed his face, as if that settled the matter.
Our cameras up there have been getting destroyed,
Piped up a camera woman, immediately turning bright red. Have they now?
It doesn't matter!
One of the producers stepped in and began to talk quietly to Manson.
Of course we have enough B-roll.
More whispers.
You really think our viewers will want to watch that?
Manson's grimace deepened. The producer spoke some final words and then backed away quickly, as if he had lit the fuse of a bomb.
Fuck! 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 Fine, we'll set out tomorrow. Haven't killed anything worthwhile in years anyway.
He stormed off, and then stopped short.
Oh,
He turned around to Nick and Shirley with a malevolent smile.
have your shit packed and be at the trailhead by 6 a.m.
Wouldn't miss it for the world!
Have you ever climbed a mountain?
How hard could it be? Chapter 10. The Spiral. Then Manson has killed the beast. Amazing. I really didn't think he had it in him. Nothing like those arsats at the History Channel. Jonas barely remembered storming out of the diner, but he somehow managed to keep his cover, muttering, The rest of the trip passed by in a series of blurs. He snuck off to the lake where Manson and his crew had been filming and watched in horror as Ventnor made an absolute fool of them.
You have bested me and are far superior in every way.
You're a fraud and couldn't kill the beast with the holy sword that pierced Christ himself. Just the thought of it sent a surge of raging hot blood through his veins. Everything he had come to believe about Manson was a lie. The realization hit him like a bullet in the chest, staggering him as if he had been mortally wounded. The hike down the mountain had taken hours, but the return trip passed by in a series of blurs. Miles were gone in seconds. Half the time, Jonas barely felt in control of his own feet. A red tint had come over his world, casting everything in a dim light. He tried to keep up the guise of being just another hiker on the trail, but with each passing minute, it became more difficult. Primal instinct surged just behind his eyes, telling him to run, slash, and hunt down those who threatened him. He thought of Manson's smug face and had to stifle a howl. Going down there was a mistake. He pictured Shirley's face and how he had almost worked up the courage to talk to her. Someone is going to pay. His body was a raging furnace, each breath spewing hot steam into the cold mountain air. He hiked with a vigour he had never known, not even on his best nights. Before he knew it, he was stepping off the main trail and onto the paths only he knew. He tried to think of where the time had gone, but the day was a blur, clouded by fierce emotion, battling for dominance. His legs were numb and mechanical, continuing to move without any real effort. After a mile or so, nearly to the cabin, he checked his surroundings to ensure there were no cameras and no curious hikers. Satisfied, he let out a roar of rage and anguish and fell to his knees. Without thought, he began pounding his fists into the packed snow of the trail, nearly digging his way down to the earth beneath. The impact of his fists on the frigid surface felt righteous. He smashed and pounded until blood poured from his knuckles and his joints were swollen. Tears ran down his cheeks, carving clean lines in the dirt. The television special was supposed to ground the legend and garner the attention it deserved. But instead, it was a joke. Manson had been a member of a secret society, not the laughingstock of it. Eventually, Jonas's adrenaline waned and weary exhaustion flooded his limbs. Lances of pain shot through the numb exterior of his beaten hands and to the muscles beneath. Through his anger for Manson, he began to see images of Nick Ventnor. It was a silver lining through the haze of pain, anger, and fatigue. Manson was not the hunter Jonas needed to face. I'm Nick Ventnor. A proper monster hunter. But Nick might be. Jonas had seen the pistol concealed on Nick's right hip and how he had casually dropped his hand to it when approached. If nothing else, he knew about the legend and had some training. The thought gave him the will to stand. Jonas pushed himself to his feet, wincing with every ounce of pressure on his hands.
That was a dumb thing to do.
He looked at his bruised knuckles, blood oozing from the places he had beaten raw.
There's still so much work to be done.
He walked to a snowbank and shoved his hands into it. Icy tendrils of beautiful, numbing pain worked their way through him. The mountain provided, and he would provide for it as well. The legend wasn't going to die. It was going to grow. I have been given a gift. I have been given a gift. I have been given a gift. In the end, Rick was going to be a far easier kill than previously anticipated. There was still the issue of getting past his crew, but Jonas hardly spared them a thought. The real challenge was going to be taking down Ventnor. 2 high-profile kills in one day. Even if he died and was exposed, he would go down as the man who was dedicated to the legend above all else. Who knows? Maybe Shirley will even write about it. When his hands were sufficiently numb, Jonas removed them. The air might have been cold, but in the moment, it felt like the breath of a dragon. His fingers thawed and steam rose from the blood into the chilled air. With each passing moment, he felt momentous purpose building. There was still work to be done and glory to be had. A fight was coming, whether Manson deserved it or not. One way or another, the legend would be made in a few days' time. Reinvigorated, Jonas trudged back in the direction of his cabin. As he approached it, he immediately noticed a package far larger than the usual drop. His employers had always stuck to the routine, and anything that broke it was suspicious. With some trepidation, he approached the parcel and tried to pick it up. He managed, but it was far heavier than what he was used to. He half carried, half dragged the box into the entryway of the cabin and shut the door behind him. Unclipping the knife from his belt, he sliced through the tape to open it. The first thing he noticed was a large sheet of yellow paper with a note scrawled on it.
Welcome to the big leagues, kid. Sounds like Manson is going to be coming up the mountain soon. You know what to do. Hopefully these gifts will help you level the playing field. Cheers. Management. P.S. Good to see you getting into town a little bit. I hope you will take the liberty again in 1 year's time. Until then, stay on the mountain. There's work to do.
Any trepidation evaporated. The note cemented exactly what it was he needed to do. Clearly, his employers also knew there was going to be a fight, and if this wasn't tacit approval, he didn't know what was. Unable to contain his excitement, Jonas began pulling out the contents of the box one by one. Christmas had come early. It was an entirely new set of gear. The suit he pulled out was far thicker and appeared to have a layer of Kevlar beneath it. It was the closest thing to bulletproof he was going to get. Next, there was a set of claws made to look like bone. Silver glinted beneath the ivory white curves of each nail. Shining razor edges had been embedded beneath them. It was light and allowed for more movement than the older model. The rest of the gear followed the trend, with higher functionality and theming than the suit he had previously worn. The final edition nearly took his breath away. At the very bottom of the box was a full headpiece. It had been moulded to sport a long, pronounced forehead, overgrown with fur, followed by deep-set eyes and a mean jaw. The effect was so lifelike that it looked as though it could have been severed from the actual shoulders of a Sasquatch. Jonas held it in his hands with great care and lowered it onto his head. Initially, it was pitch black inside, but after a few seconds, screens illuminated where the eye holes would have been. The dark interior of his cabin lit up in shades of red and blue. Jonas raised a hand in front of him and marveled at the white-hot center fading to red around the edges. A wave of deep gratitude swept over him. No one had ever given him such a gift. The playing field hadn't just been leveled, it had been flipped.
Manson isn't going to stand a chance.
Chapter 11. The Light of the Morning. A light chill had crept into the air as Shirley and Nick arrived at the forestry centre. Bright sunlight filtered through the trees, cutting radiant beams in the early morning fog. Sets, cameras and lights had all been broken down and strapped to a series of interns who looked more overburdened than yaks in the Himalayas. With their backs bent, they looked to be regretting their employment decisions. All told, there were about 20 people ready to head up the mountain. To both Nick and Shirley's dismay, there was no sign of Manson.
That prick better show up,
stuttered Nick, halfway through a gulp from his water bottle.
Should you really be drinking right now?
Shirley's eyes watered as she caught a brief whiff of whatever was inside the container.
If the beast is what I think it is, I'm going to want to be good and buzzed when we find it.
He cocked an eye at Shirley and apologetically offered.
You want some?
He held the bottle out to her.
No, thanks. I don't drink.
Nick looked at her, very confused.
Ever?
Ever.
Shirley had spent years trying to avoid the spectre of alcoholism that came with depression, and had so far been successful. She might have been the only dry member of the local I staff.
Yeah, suit yourself.
Nick shook the confusion off and fished around in his bag. Eventually, he pulled out a pistol that could only be described as dainty.
You ever use one of these?
No.
Well, it's quite...
Shirley lifted the corner of her jacket, unclipped the holster at her side, and drew a significantly larger handgun.
If you pulled that on a bear, it might laugh you to death.
Nick held the pistol limply, trying not to look too envious.
This,
she pointed the pistol at the ground, looking down the iron sights,
would stop anything in its tracks.
Nick reddened.
Bet it doesn't have holy water on it.
Do bears care about holy water?
Yep. Piss off anyway. Where is Manson?
He straightened, looking for a target of ridicule that wasn't himself. The cast and crew milled about, trying not to garner Nick's attention. It seemed that word of what happened to the last production assistant travelled fast. Nick looked as though he might sprint and throttle one of them again. But luckily, Manson appeared just in time. He might as well have walked straight out of a camping store commercial. While the equipment was clearly brand new, it had been made to look scuffed and worn. The signs were clear to Shirley, but on camera they would be hardly noticeable. If there was one thing Manson was good at, it was presentation. He strode to the middle of the campground, motioning for a camera to follow him.
All right, thanks to everyone who stuck around. This is without a doubt going to be one of the most dangerous shoots we've ever been on.
He looked to the camera, dead in the lens, cementing the fact.
There have been some accusations that we aren't brave enough to go after the Beast, and that our entire operation is a fraud.
He waved a hand flippantly in Nick's direction.
Today, we prove those rumours to be nothing but a pack of lies.
As Manson droned on, Nick turned to Shirley.
You have to admit, he's good in front of a camera.
Shirley shrugged.
I guess if we run into a TV exec up there pretending to be Bigfoot, we'll be in good hands.
An eternity later, Manson's speech ended and it was time for the real work to commence. His booming bravado didn't stop for a second.
Let's get moving. We got a lot of ground to cover today.
He sounded and looked like a 1900s explorer leading a group of adventurers into the bush. It was the all khaki everywhere that sold the image. In the distance, storm clouds were building, and Shirley made a note to keep an eye on them. She was always prepared and had packed for the worst of weather, but the rest of the team looked like they could only handle a flake or two at most. Forecasting Clearwater were notorious for changing at a moment's notice. The weatherman always said it was due to the mountain range making patterns, but most of the town figured it was his drinking. At the forestry centre, the temperature had dropped to freezing overnight and was struggling to come back up. It would warm throughout the day, but come evening, they might be in trouble. Shirley tapped Nick.
Those storm clouds might be an issue.
He looked up at them with a sense of unease.
Think we can handle it?
I think we can ride them out if we have to, but if we get caught in a storm, sitting in a tent is about all we're going to accomplish until it passes.
Nick tapped the flask at his side.
Good thing I brought this then.
Is there anything you solve without drinking?
Nick scratched his chin as if preparing to answer, and then turned his attention to Manson instead. He walked just close enough to be sure that one of the main sound technicians would capture him.
Better get moving if you want to beat that storm.
Immediately, 2 interns who had been shooting B-roll pointed their camera skyward to capture the impending threat. Manson scowled.
What's the matter? Afraid of a light dusting?
Nick looked back at the clouds. Even he knew they were much darker than a light dusting. But if Manson was going, he was going.
Hey, if our fearless leader thinks we can make it, then I've got all the faith in the world.
Nick cocked a ridiculous smile at the nearest camera and gave an enthusiastic thumbs up. Manson practically growled at the idea of sharing his camera time.
Let's not lose this daylight!
The crew chugged into motion like an old locomotive and started up the trail. Shirley hustled to catch the front of the line, not wanting to miss any of the action. But Nick held her back.
Easy there,
he said, slowing her pace until they were being passed by even the slowest crew members. He waited until every one of them had filed onto the trail and then fell into step at the end of the line.
I would have thought you'd be jockeying with Manson for the lead.
She mocked in genuine surprise. Nick smiled.
I never travel at the front of the line. All that stuff in movies about stragglers getting picked off, it's just propaganda to inspire courage. Yep. If there's a beast up there, I want to make sure Manson runs into it first. Besides, we'll have a better chance of finding clues back here if we're not being hassled by all those goddamn interns.
He said the last line loudly and with venom. One of the young men carrying sound equipment just ahead of them flinched.
Too easy.
What was initially excited chatter from the crew about finally doing something real was quickly extinguished by the exhaustion that came from carrying an entire film set uphill. The lower trails of Clearwater Mountain were easy enough, but getting anywhere near the summit with even minimal gear was an exhausting task. Accomplished mountaineers would have laughed at the sweat and toil of the crew, but to them it might as well have been Everest. As the group crested a particularly steep set of switchbacks, Nick stopped off to the side of the trail, panting. He set his pack down. The line continued to move ahead, taking no notice.
What's the matter? Tired?
Nick bent down, ignoring her. and examined something clinging to the bark of a tree. How he had seen it was a mystery. From a distance, it looked like any other moss or lichen. Shirley thought he was simply stalling for a reason to catch his breath. "That's very interesting," he murmured, reaching into his bag and pulled out a large leather-bound book.
No wonder you're exhausted. What on earth possessed you to bring that?
Possession had nothing to do with it. He flipped through the pages. Eventually, he reached one with a sketch of a tall, ape-like creature, easily recognizable as Sasquatch. He skimmed the lines with his finger, holding the moss next to the book for identification. "Are there any native tribes in the area?" Shirley scuffed her shoes in the dirt.
Not anymore. Townsfolk drove them out years ago.
"Drove them out?" asked Nick, pushing the small sample into a plastic-lined pocket of his backpack and snapping the book shut.
Clearwater wasn't exactly hospitable.
"Oh, good. So I suppose the hope of a cultural centre would be a folly."
We've got one about logging.
"Wonderful. If we have to deal with a chainsaw-wielding spirit, we'll be in luck." Nick picked up the pace and hustled to catch the back of the line. It wasn't hard at the languid pace they were making. Shirley walked beside him.
What was that you found?
"We are meant to believe it's fur."
Meant to believe?
I haven't ruled out the genuine article yet, but I see no reason that clump would have gotten stuck on that tree. It's far too obvious. I think we were meant to find it. Shirley thought the sample would have been difficult to notice by anyone who hadn't been paying close attention.
Why would anyone want to leave a fake sample?
Fame? Glory? Make the History Channel look like an idiot after the episode is released? Sounds like something I might do. If I had my analysis kit with me, we could find out for sure, but he motioned to the bag on his back with a slight groan. As you said, too much weight. I really thought we might find a Sasquatch up here, but looks like it might just be another pretender. Shirley felt an all too familiar unhappiness rising inside her.
These attacks are very real,
she snapped, immediately regretting the tone.
Sorry.
If Nick had taken offence, he didn't show it. I have no doubt about that. I've seen the photos. Nick stopped to examine Shirley for a second. Who did you know that was killed?
I'm sorry?
Mother? Brother? Father? Sister? Lover? Nick watched her expression closely with each suggestion. Which was it? Shirley felt a tingling begin at the back of her spine.
Oh, shit.
Without warning, it felt like someone had gripped her chest in a vice. Her vision wavered and everything felt sluggish. With numb fingers, she pulled out a small orange bottle she kept in her pocket and put one of the pills under her tongue. She could feel the forest closing in around her and struggled to stay on her feet.
This is it. I'm going to die on the side of an intermediate hiking trail, witnessed by a drunk.
Slowly, she sunk to one knee, trying to keep her breathing in check. Around her, the sounds of the forest disappeared, replaced with the frantic beating of her own heart and 1,000 shouting voices telling her that she was about to die. Ever since the incident, there were moments Shirley couldn't even deal with the mention of it. There was no consistent pattern to them, but with panic attacks, there never was. Through a lot of hard work and countless hours in the therapist's office, she had reduced the frequency, but in that moment, nothing seemed to help. A dark tunnel closed in around her vision, signalling that, yes, death had indeed come for her. Nick dropped the all-knowing act immediately and knelt next to her. Are you all right? Genuine concern had crept into his voice. Shirley tried to speak, but her voice caught in the back of her throat. What was there to say anyway?
I'm dying because you mentioned her?
Lindsay wasn't the boogeyman. Even the thought of her name caused crime scene images to play before her like an old film reel. The trees had been covered in her, and there had just been so much blood.
Stop!
She thought, and the memories began to quiet. Easy, Shirley. Just breathe. He put a hand on her shoulder and uncapped his flask with the other, taking a quick drink. Slowly, the voices shouting in Shirley's head began to fade as the pill went to work. Eventually, she managed to speak.
She was very close to me. I don't talk about it.
Her heartbeat slowed to a dull thud. I'm sorry. You should have told me this was personal. I just thought you were insane.
Well, you weren't wrong.
You're right to walk? Shirley nodded. Nick helped pull her to her feet, and she stood unsteadily. Nick tightened her pack, and then they were moving back to the end of the line. After a while, Shirley felt the sounds of the forest return and her tension eased. When she had caught her breath, she resumed the conversation.
What else could possibly be doing this?
Nick didn't miss a beat. A lot of things when you think about it. Victims have been decapitated, slashed, mauled, you name it. The only consistency is the brutality. Nick winced, remembering the sensitivity of the situation, but did not apologise. Shirley didn't mind. She preferred brutal honesty to people walking on eggshells around her.
And the presence of 4 claws.
She reminded him. The thought brought a slight grimace to her face. Right, and the claw marks. It certainly does fit the bill of a territorial dispute, but without any knowledge from the people that were here first, we have no way of knowing. Sasquatch will stay in one region their entire life, which can be hundreds of years. That's why there's so few of them left. Even when pioneers came with muskets and torches and colonisation, the Sasquatch stayed in the same spot, choosing to fight and die rather than leave. There was a low and melancholy respect for the beast in his words. A light snow began to fall around them. Well, this is sooner than expected, said Nick, sticking his tongue out cheerily. Shirley looked up at the clouds, dismayed.
That's not good. If the storm is moving that quickly, it's going to be a big one.
Something our pal up front should know about?
Probably.
Well then, let's pay him a visit. Manson was slick with sweat, despite the cold, barking at anybody who bothered to distract him from the monumental task of putting one foot in front of the other. Cameras buzzed around him like flies, no doubt shooting footage that would later be cut to preserve Manson's pristine reputation. Next to him was a young woman with a map, looking far less exhausted and far more excited.
How much further?
We should be about halfway to the falls by now.
Halfway?
The trails were still clear, but on the sides, the crew began to see piles of snow from the last storm. The farther up they got, the more snowpack there would be and the harder the hike was going to get. Unfortunately, the trails also got steeper just before the falls. Well, it's about to get a lot harder if this storm keeps up, said Nick jovially, jogging to the front of the line.
Jesus Christ! Why are you here?
I don't know how many times I have to tell you, Manson. I might be better than you, but I'm not the son of...
Shut it! I don't have time for your childish games today.
A cameraman moved up close beside them, wanting to capture the confrontation. Well, you see...
At the rate this storm is moving, we're going to be stuck in a full-on blizzard by nightfall.
Well, it's a good thing we brought all this gear in.
I don't think you understand. Most people would turn back.
Clearly you have never operated on a schedule, Miss Codwell. I don't suspect that tabloid enforces them.
Shirley balled her fist up, ready to strike him. The cameraman zoomed to it.
No, we are not turning around. We are nearly there. If it's going to snow, then we'll find the beast in a whiteout. We've done it before and we'll do it again. Now kindly fuck off to somewhere that isn't next to me.
Shirley was ready to argue more, but Nick pulled her back. Together, they waited for the line to pass and once more began to bring up the rear. So, we've got what we need to survive the storm? Asked Nick, looking for reassurance.
Yes, but it won't be comfortable. Do we have what we need to survive whatever is out there?
Nick began counting his fingers and mumbling something about holy powder.
Nick?
He looked up as if completely forgetting the question.
Nick? Can we survive it?
Probably. Better odds than most of the time, anyway. He rubbed his hands together excitedly. This is going to be fun. I love camping. Chapter 12. Hunter. Killer. Jonas stood freezing atop the lookout in disbelief. They're actually going to try and hike through this. He had seen the storm coming and assumed Manson's team would wait for another day, if they attempted at all. The national weather broadcast, much better than the local hack, had come to the conclusion that no person in their right mind should attempt the upper mountain during the storm. But then again, he supposed Rick wasn't exactly in his right mind.
This is going to be much easier than I thought.
The storm afforded two important advantages: stealth and exhaustion of his opponent. In the days following his encounter at the diner, Jonas had been trying to think of the best way to approach his prey without being seen. Every scenario ended with him taking a bullet before getting to Manson, and a few more before reaching Ventnor. Ordinarily, he didn't worry much about stealth. Most hikers were armed, but panicked in the moment. In all his attacks, a hiker had drawn their gun once, but even then had failed to fire. Manson's team was better trained, and likely wouldn't make the same mistake. The storm would provide cover, allowing Jonas to get close without being seen. The storm would also exhaust Manson's crew. They were inexperienced in this climate, and the hike to the falls was no Sunday stroll, even in fair weather. By the time they made it to Jonas's chosen battlefield, they would be dead on their feet. The powder below the falls was deep and would slow their movement. He, on the other hand, had more than enough experience running in inclement weather. In short, he had home field advantage. Jonas checked his watch. It was just past 7 in the morning, and the crew had barely made it out of the lower trails. At their current pace, they would make the falls by dark, but that was assuming they followed the samples he had left. The snow was going to make that difficult. It would take him an hour to get back to the cabin, and at least another 2 to hike out to the trails. Jonas estimated that if he left immediately, he could cut back onto the main path just below the falls and egg the crew on from a safe distance. A few well-placed howls and snapped branches would keep them moving in the right direction. He started down the mountain at a quick clip. The storm would slow him, and he had every intention of being back on the trail before it got any worse. Once more, he found himself running through battlefield scenarios. There were a million ways his attack on the History Channel crew could go wrong, and very few where it went right. Still, he felt an unbridled confidence about it. There was a reassuring sense within him that today was the day the legend would rise. When he arrived, the cabin was warmed by the still glowing embers from his morning fire. The brown bottle in the kitchen counter had enough left in it for one last drink, but he decided to save it for a victorious return. If he didn't make it back, it wasn't going to be his problem anyway. Despite his confidence, Jonas still felt a hollow fear resonating in his bones. He supposed any good warrior did when they were facing death. Like making a prayer at an altar, Jonas ran his hands across Shirley's articles tacked to his wall one more time. Years of work, all culminating to one moment. In less than 12 hours, it would all be over. He would either be dead in the snow or a true legend. Both outcomes filled him with a great swelling sense of pride. He had never feared death. In fact, he welcomed it. After killing Nick and Manson, he wasn't sure what else would be left for him. That was a question for later. Time was short. Jonas took a final look around his cabin that had been his home over the last 5 years. He regretted none of the moments he had spent there. The new suit hung on a rack next to the door and called to him. It looked like armor built for a warrior, and in a way, it was. He ran a hand lightly across the artificial fur and felt his skin prickle with excitement.
This is it. The last suit you'll ever wear.
The hide was thick, but somehow felt lighter than the old gear. It fit better too, as if it had been tailor-made. Jonas began with the suit's body, adjusting internal straps to ensure that it fit snugly and didn't prohibit movement. He then buckled into the new snowshoes. There was no leaving them off this time. He had to be authentic the entire way, just in case. Next was the new headpiece, which made a satisfying click as it was attached to a metal ring around the neck of the body. Servo's whirred in the headpiece, and a readout of the suit's integrity popped up on the bottom right corner of his display. Running one last check, Jonas took a deep breath, grabbed the gloves, and opened the door to his cabin. Outside, light snow was falling, and a bitter chill had entered the air. In the distance, dark clouds advanced. The storm would be on the mountain by nightfall, if not earlier.
Not much time left.
He slipped the gloves onto his hands and admired the claws in the grey light. It was time. Ascending the mountain took Jonas a little longer than usual. He had a general idea of where Manson's team was, but he needed to be cautious. At the rate they were moving, he would have to hike at a snail's pace for them to pull ahead. Around 3 in the afternoon, the light began to leave the mountain. The clouds above grew thick, closing in and shrouding the frosted forest in grey. Snow began to fall in earnest, speckling his fur with thick, white flakes. Occasionally, Jonas would catch glimpses of Manson's crew in the distance. Whenever he did, he quickly got out of sight and let out his best howl. The first time he did this, even he felt chilled. As it turned out, the suit had been augmented with a microphone in the headpiece that caught Jonas's howl, distorted it, and then magnified. The resulting sound was pure terror in every form as it echoed through the trees.
Now that's the real deal,
he thought, reflecting on the mediocre howls he had produced before. Once he was a good distance ahead of Manson's crew, Jonas moved closer to the main trail. They had likely heard the howls, but now it was time to give them more direction. In the days leading up to the trek, he had been able to mangle a few cameras and leave some fur samples, but he doubted anyone would find the latter. The snow would erase most of his earlier work. Jonas redoubled his efforts, leaving obvious broken branches and slashes in the exact direction he wanted Manson to go. He had planned to search for more of the team's remote gear, but as he was walking, he found something far more noticeable. It seemed the preparation of the History Channel crew had given him a gift. He crouched low in a thicket just off the trail and watched as a few hundred feet ahead, a shivering cameraman hiked up the trail. His headlight bobbed and swung back and forth as he looked up to the trees for signs of danger.
Must have sent him up to scout.
The man was carrying a large camera strapped to his back and held a rifle loosely between gloved hands.
Wrong place. Very wrong time.
Jonas crept forward, moving out of the thicket and into the fresh snow on the trail. His footsteps were silent. The man alone was moving much faster than Manson's team, and Jonas guessed he had drawn the shortest straw. Manson might be able to miss the branches and fur, but they weren't going to miss this. The cameraman was strictly focused in front of him, no doubt thinking of the danger that lay ahead. Jonas seized the opportunity and broke into a run. There was no time for hesitancy. Jonas lumbered towards him, feeling more beast than man, the suit merely an extension of his body. He flexed his fingers and felt the sharp blades beneath each of them. He was only 100 feet away before the man noticed anything was wrong. Maybe it was a sixth sense. Maybe Jonas's footsteps had been a touch too loud. But either way, the man turned when Jonas was about 10 feet away. The rifle dropped from his hands and landed with a soft thump in the snow. His eyes were wide with terror, and he held his hands up in a reflexive defense posture. The man let out a blood-curdling scream. And Jonas struck. Chapter 13. Murder on the Mountain. The cast and crew were continuing their languid pace up the mountain. Shirley watched as one by one their headlamps turned on in the growing darkness, creating crisscrossing cones of light. In that instant, she knew that something was very wrong. The forest had gone quiet. The lights looked hollow, and the world felt charged, as if it were waiting for something to happen. The hairs on her arms stood on end. This is too obvious. No creature that's lived for 100 years is this clumsy. Every mile they travelled up the mountain, signs of the beast appeared more frequently. Tree bark along the trail's edge was slashed. Fur hung in clumps from the trees. Something is not right about this. Shirley paid him no attention. Without realising it, her hand had dropped to the pistol at her side.
Hey! Hey!
Nick snapped his fingers in front of her face.
Don't you get it?
Stress lines creased the corner of his eyes.
It's leaving us breadcrumbs. Animals don't do that. Things that want to be found do.
Shirley's fingers moved automatically to unclip the pistol from its holster. She had barely heard Nick's words. Something was still very off.
Do you want to get cooked by a witch, Gretel?
Her fingers closed around the pistol grip when a scream cut through the otherwise quiet forest. The sound was horrifying. It stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The crew stopped dead, everyone looking wildly around at the dark forest surrounding them.
That's why you stay at the back of the line.
He drew his pistol and began moving towards Manson. Shirley followed suit. A panicked murmur spread among the crew as they began to fan out, still looking for the source of the noise. Manson had remained at the front of the line, but his eyes had grown wide with fear. He too was searching the trees for the source of the noise. He clung to an oversized rifle like his life depended on it. It probably did. By how he was holding it, Shirley wondered if he had actually ever used it.
Who was it?
Whispered Nick, sidling up to Manson. Manson stayed silent for a moment. Shirley kept her eyes on the path ahead of them. The scream had come from further up the mountain. She was sure of it. The trail ahead was illuminated by only their headlamps. Snowflakes fell with ghostly quiet.
I
started Manson, and then he stopped. The reality of the situation had finally dawned on him.
Who was it?
I sent a scout up to get some establishing shots.
He spoke languidly, like a man in a dream.
We should turn back,
said Nick, making sure to keep his voice low.
Whatever is up there is baiting us. Don't be silly. It's a wild animal.
He adjusted his headlamp and raised the rifle to the tree line.
It's hunting.
The performance was quite impressive until he glanced to his right to make sure a camera was still trained on him. One crew member had remained dedicated to the cause and was dutifully filming Manson, holding the camera with shaking hands.
Well, you're right about one thing. It's hunting, but it's not a wild animal.
He was growing exasperated, and the pallid fear was plain to see behind his eyes.
We need to turn around and think of a better plan that isn't walking into a trap.
While it pained Shirley to be on the same side as Manson, she didn't like the idea of leaving anyone on the mountain to die.
We can't just leave them up there. They might be hurt.
She knew as well as they did that the person was probably dead. But if there was even a chance...
The dead don't feel pain. Whoever it was has it easier than us now. Yes, we're not going to leave a crew member behind. We've never lost anyone on this program, and I don't plan on starting tonight.
Nick threw his hands up in frustration.
You've already lost them, Rick!
He pointed a finger up the dark trail.
The only thing waiting for us up there is a trap and a corpse. And I, for one, don't have a high motivation to find either of them. If you're too scared, feel free to turn around. We never had need of your services to begin with.
A malevolent grin spread across Manson's face.
Although, I imagine it will be hard for a respectable monster hunter to find work after they were proved a coward on national television. Son of a bitch!
Nick stomped away, running a hand through his hair.
Come on! Time is of the essence! We need to save...
He trailed off and looked to a production assistant that had returned to his side. The assistant was still clearly stunned, but managed to mouth, Bob.
We need to save Bob!
With that, Manson's fear evaporated, giving way to the one emotion that was stronger. Pride. He continued his mad march up the mountain. Shirley, unsure of what to do, walked over to where Nick was fuming.
Arsehole. If we turn around now, then we're two prey alone on this mountain. Unless it's after Manson specifically, we'd be the easier target.
His pistol was gripped firmly in his right hand, his finger held sideways against the safety. ready to move at the slightest hint of danger.
He played us, Shirley.
Weren't you saying earlier that it wasn't a Sasquatch anyway?
It seemed that mending Nick's damaged psyche was a more pressing need than the likely murdered cameraman further up.
Yeah? What's that got to do with it?
Shouldn't it be less dangerous?
Nick's eyes widened with incredulity.
Absolutely not. Sasquatches are predictable. Humans, on the other hand, especially the bloodthirsty kind, are irrational, impulsive, and among the most dangerous creatures on the planet. Mark my words, when we get to the top of this damn mountain, someone is going to die, and they're going to die quick. You might want to pull out a notepad, because the local Eye is going to be running a special on obituaries.
With that, Nick pushed a few interns out of the way and rejoined the line, this time in the middle. Shirley hurried after him. It didn't take them long to reach the source of the attack and realise that, as Nick had said, it was far too late. They found the cameraman kneeling in the centre of the path in a deep puddle of his own blood. Steam rose in lazy tendrils from the body. Frost coated his lips and the life had long since left his eyes.
You want to check for a pulse?
Asked Nick, stepping out of the line.
I think you might still be able to save him. A man has died here, Nick.
Gagged Manson, turning away from the sight.
You three.
He pointed at the interns.
Wrap him up and get him down the mountain.
The interns stepped forward silently and went to work. Shirley guessed that they were willing to do anything if it got them off the mountain. She had a half mind to join them, but seeing the attack brought it all back.
Not again.
Crime scene photos flashed before her once more, and it was as if she was right there again. She could see her partner's face, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The cold green room with the metal tables swam before her eyes. Just then, a howl cut through her thoughts like a knife. It was deep, low, and mournful. Even Nick took a break from berating Manson for poor leadership to listen. With amazing speed, he pulled a tape recorder from his pocket and caught the last few seconds of it. Then he walked around, holding the recorder out to the forest, waiting for it to happen again.
What was that? Shh! That's the monster you came up here to destroy.
Chapter 14. Smile for the camera. Jonas waited. He could still feel the tearing sensation of the kill on his hands. Only this time, it was different. The other attacks had required a degree of measured precision. This one just felt like instinct. From his vantage point, he could see the entire snowy field below the frozen falls. He knew getting Manson's team to scale the chute was an impossibility. He was going to have to face them on the open plain. The thick powder would slow them down, and the storm had begun in earnest, providing the cover he desperately needed. Heavy flakes fell continuously, and a thick white fog had crept into the air. Visibility was poor, and he doubted anyone would be able to see even 10 feet in front of them. Luckily, the crew were all wearing headlamps. Their reflections on the flakes would light up the field like the 4th of July. After that, it was just a matter of speed. He would need to cross the field before any of them noticed something was wrong. Across the field, he could see the dim glow of lights emerging from the forest. Jonas took care as he picked his way down the chute, not wanting to end the fight before it even began. Soon, he was at the bottom, creeping into the snowy field, feeling the wind across his fur. He looked down at his arm and saw the brown fur flecked with white.
Even better for camouflage.
His legs tensed in anticipation as the glow grew brighter and he began to hear voices. They had made it. And just like that, time slowed to a crawl. Jonas switched to heat vision and saw 10 figures approaching. It was a surprise that Moore had not turned around at the sight of the body, but he supposed it didn't matter. The crew stopped at the edge of the tree line, swinging their heads back and forth, scanning the field.
What are they doing?
As if in answer to his question, he saw one of them raise something into the air. A moment later, a spotlight illuminated, momentarily causing him to squint. One of the figures stepped into the spotlight, and Jonas heard a voice carrying over the wind. It was Manson, speaking with the same boldness he was known for on television.
The idiot is still doing the piece.
Despite the bodies and the conditions, Manson was still shooting his television show. He's persistent, I'll give him that. Of the 10 that were there, 8 were armed with rifles and 2 carried pistols. Jonas didn't know which one would be Ventnor, but his primary target was visible. There was no hesitation. He took off across the field as fast as he could, tearing through the powder easily with his new snowshoes. Jonas didn't immediately go for Manson. Darkness was his priority. The crew had all turned off their headlamps, ensuring that no one would mess up the lighting for the shot. Jonas scanned the area and saw a camera woman shivering, fumbling with something just beneath the light. It was the portable battery source. Too easy. As he neared, he could see the nervous figures pointing their weapons out in all directions. He was past the point of no return. Jonas put on a final burst of speed and leapt into the light. He was illuminated only for a moment, a hulking mass of brown fur streaking through the field like a cannonball. The crew stood motionless, frozen in terror and unable to fire their weapons. From the right, there was a loud crack as a pistol shot rang out, and Jonas felt a stinging pressure where it had struck the armor. The spot where the bullet had hit quickly went numb. Paying no heed, he stayed his course, and with a quick slash, cut the power line, sending sputtering sparks into the field. The mountain was plunged once more into darkness. Flashes erupted in the night as the crew shook off their confusion and survival instincts took over. It was as if some hive mind told them to start firing at the same time. Jonas thought it was a miracle none of them hit each other. Bullets whizzed past him, but none found their mark. There were loud crunches as the bullets ricocheted into the ice wall behind him and bounced harmlessly into the deep, snowy field.
Headlamps, you idiot!
Shouted Manson. Immediately, cones of light burst into being, temporarily blinding and confusing the crew.
Aim center mass and group together,
called one of the men from the side.
Don't bother with the head. If it separates us, it'll pick us off one by one.
Jonas could only assume it was Ventnor. The voice carried the same cocky demeanor, and his suggestions weren't asinine. Jonas had moved away from the main group and lay low, concealed behind a snowdrift. Light swept back and forth, searching, but the storm prevented them from spotting him. Ventnor was right, of course. It'd be much harder to pick them off when they were tightly clustered. That wasn't going to do. Carefully, Jonas moved out from behind the snowdrift, sucked in a big breath, and let out his mightiest roar. The sound echoed across the field, reverberating back almost as if there were 2 of him. Immediately, the group trained their guns on his position and began to fire. The real question is how much ammunition they have. The roar worked like a charm. After the first few seconds of firing, the group slowly began to scatter.
Stick with me!
Yelled Manson, trying to worm his way between interns for safety.
Coward!
Jonas roared again, running circles around the group. Soon, the crew was scattered completely, and Manson was exposed. Jonas saw his moment and seized it. He leapt forward into Manson's direct line of sight. He wanted to see his face when the blow came down. Manson's eyes locked with his. Terror seized the man, and the bravado was gone in an instant. He raised his rifle, arm shaking, and fired. A plume of snow shot up next to Jonas. He continued to run. Manson fired again, and Jonas heard a sickening crunch as a high-caliber bullet struck his left shoulder.
Body armor can only protect against so much,
he thought, trying to block out the pain. The left side of his body quickly grew numb.
It doesn't matter. Stay the course.
Manson was between Jonas and the rest of the crew, making it impossible for them to fire on him. When there was only 5 feet between them, Jonas could smell the powder, the barrel pointed right at his head. At this range, it wouldn't matter. He prepared for the darkness, smiling, knowing that he would die a warrior's death. His heart rate sped up, thumping in his chest, trying to get in as many beats as possible before the end. Manson pulled the trigger of the rifle one final time. But there was a hollow click. Manson was out of ammunition. Jonas almost stumbled, but maintained his momentum. With massive force, he plunged both claws into Manson's abdomen and swept him into the air. He held him aloft for a moment, stunned at what he had accomplished. Slowly, he brought Manson to eye level, watching as the fraud sputtered and gasped, trying to say something. Jonas howled fearsomely and then pulled back, letting the body drop to the ground. Most of the crew had run, but 2 remained. Manson's death was sweet, but there was no time for savouring. He looked at the pair standing in front of him and turned off his heat vision to get a better look. He only had a second to take it in. Standing before him was Nick Ventnor and... Shirley's handgun went off, hitting Jonas in the side. The pain he felt was immeasurable, but nothing compared to how he felt seeing her standing next to Ventnor. Nick had a pistol of his own, raised and was taking careful aim. Nick pulled the trigger, missing only by a hair. Running on pure instinct, Jonas fled. Shots rang out behind him, but neither hit their mark. He ran into the darkness, using the storm for cover. Sharp pain spiderwebbed out from where the bullet had hit the armor on his shoulder, and his side throbbed. While the pain was intense, only the shot in his side had actually gone through. It would need attention, but he still had a chance. Either way, he needed to fight fast and regain the element of stealth. Chapter 15. Running Blind.
Christ, he's heavy,
panted Nick, throwing an arm under Manson. The man was bleeding like a stuck pig and clearly on death's door.
Come on, Shirley. Give me a hand with this.
Shirley wasn't able to move, much less help. She was still shocked by the speed at which it had all happened. The attack was blinding and ended just as quickly as it had begun. The rest of the crew was nowhere to be found. Likely, they were trying to make their way down the mountain in the storm. Without a guide, their chances of making it back were slim, but she didn't blame them for running. The sight of that creature had filled her with such a primal fear that she had barely been able to squeeze the revolver's trigger. Flakes continued to fall unabated, creating speckles in the yellow light of their headlamps. They fell on Manson, melting red. He coughed and spluttered, spitting up blood and trying to talk. His body shook briefly with convulsions, and then he looked up at Nick with wide eyes.
It...
Nick struggled to keep him down.
Easy, Rick. It's all right. I've seen much worse. Shirley, if you please.
Shirley knelt beside Manson, the stench of death already apparent. The slash ran all the way up Manson's sternum. For every inch they dragged him, he left pieces of himself behind.
It was real.
Manson's eyes went wide. His body shuddered one final time, and then he fell still. Nick put 2 fingers to Manson's neck, feeling for a pulse. When he found none, he bowed his head, running a hand across Manson's face and shutting his eyes.
To hunt the myth is to die by it. He may have been a prick, but he was part of something bigger. He earned those words.
Nick stood and spat next to the body.
What the hell?
Shirley hadn't liked the man, but spitting on his corpse was too far.
What? He earned that too.
In her rage, Shirley nearly forgot that while Manson was dead, the beast wasn't.
What is the matter with you?
Nick shrugged.
He's dead. Doesn't matter to him anymore. And I needed closure.
Do you think it's still hunting us?
I'm almost certain of it. Did you see the way it looked at us?
Shirley shuddered.
So, we can either try to hightail it down the mountain with the rest of them.
She gestured in the direction the crew had gone.
Or we can finish this fight while the beast is still injured.
She was shocked by her own words. Her body was telling her repeatedly to turn and run, but something inside her still wanted to fight. On autopilot, her hand flicked out the revolver's chamber and began replacing the spent shells.
I'm up for a fight if you are,
said Nick, trying to hide the fact that he was panting from exhaustion.
Lucky for us, it left a trail.
Leading away from the spot they had shot the beast was a streak of red blood. In the heavy snow, it was quickly becoming obscured, but for the moment, it was still visible.
Then there's no time to waste. After you, Shirley.
Nick pulled the flask from his pocket and finished it in one long gulp.
I'd share, but trust me, I need this more than you do.
Shirley shook her head and started off in the direction the beast had gone. In the open field, the trail of blood may have been almost buried by the fresh powder, but in the forest, it was still a dark red line, leading them forward. The trees looked ghostly in the pallid glow of her headlamp, and she could feel each heartbeat like footsteps of a tyrannosaur. The trail narrowed as the forest rose up around them on either side. Nick looked uneasy, swapping his pistol between the right and left sides, muttering to himself. Gradually, the trail curved to the left, and the blood went unmistakably forward into a deep thicket of bushes. Shirley stopped and held out a hand. Without saying a word, she motioned to the bush.
He's still in there,
said Nick, pulling the hammer back on his pistol. Shirley winced at the audible click it made and followed suit.
Any bright ideas?
Yeah, you run, now.
His eyes never left the bush.
I'm not going anywhere.
But a raging howl cut her off. The echo was deafening and felt like it came from all sides. It took all of Shirley's effort to keep her hands on the pistol and away from her ears. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. On instinct, she began backing away.
Why do they always announce themselves before they attack? You're not scaring anyone here!
The tremble in his voice said otherwise. Shirley continued to back away until she was a good 15 feet behind Nick. A piece of her wanted to stay close, stick with the fight. But a stronger motivation drove her back. It was not cowardly, just self-preservation. Nick fished through his pockets, pulling out a gold cross on a chain. He wrapped it around his pistol. Shirley didn't have time to ask about it. From the top of the ravine on the right, the beast lunged in a deadly arc. Straight at Nick. Chapter 16. The Man, the Myth, the Legend. Jonas wanted Shirley to leave, wanted her to get away as far as possible. The longer she stayed, the higher the chance that he was going to have to kill her. The thought alone made him sick to his stomach.
You're not scaring anyone here!
He heard Nick yell across the field. For a professional, he's not the brightest. Jonas shifted to get a better look and winced as he put pressure on his wounds. Blood continued to run in a steady stream down his side, and he knew that if he didn't get back to his medical supplies soon, he was going to bleed out. Better make this quick then. He took a deep breath, ignoring the pain, and prepared to charge. Ventnor was pointing his pistol at a thicket of bushes a good 50 feet from his position. Jonas made a quick calculation of the distance between them. The jump would be painful, but the element of surprise was invaluable. Shirley had begun to back away, and Jonas felt thankful. Now run away, before I finish my business here. With that, Jonas leapt from the top of the ravine, letting out a roar. As he catapulted through the air, the scene rendered in sharp focus before him. Adrenaline pumped through his veins, and it felt as though he could see in more detail than he ever had before. Once more, he felt confidence surging through him. This was it. He had one shot, one moment, and he would not let it slip. Nick was reacting to the attack, but not quick enough. Jonas pulled back a claw to strike. At the last second, Nick was able to roll out the way, but not before his swipe knocked the gun from his hands and raked red lines across his inner arm. Jonas stumbled upon landing, skidding through the snow and into the other side of the embankment. The impact was agony, but he spun around with lightning speed, preparing to attack again. In the confusion, he had lost sight of Shirley. Good, it's better that way. She would have a head start and might even get away. As he recovered, Nick drew a long knife from a sheath concealed in his jacket. The blade was so long that it might as well have been a machete. Deep red splatters and streaks stained the snow between them, and Nick's arm was soaked where Jonas had struck. The man's face was pale, but still full of fight. Jonas admired him, and through the pain, he could not help but smile. This was the fight he had been waiting for.
Come on then! I'm not scared of a psychopath that likes playing dress up!
Shouted Nick, holding the knife out like a lance. That threw Jonas off balance. He knew? It was the opportunity Nick needed. Rather than waiting for Jonas to attack or going for the gun, Nick ran forward before he could react. There was a brief shooting pain as the knife drove into his heavily bruised shoulder, followed once more by a numbness. Jonas saw Nick's eyes, full of hunger, but lacking fear. That was his mistake. He batted him away with his good arm, sending Nick sprawling into the snow. The knife stayed in Jonas's shoulder, and he reached over to pull it out. The blade was sunk to the hilt. He grimaced, gripped the handle, ripped it out, and threw the blade away, shaking off nausea. He then advanced on the stunned Nick, feeling more lightheaded by the second. Probably should have left it in. Doesn't matter. Time to finish this. He did his best to savor each step, knowing there might not be a more important moment in his life. This was it. No matter what else happened, he would be famous. Everyone would know what he did.
A real Sasquatch would have the decency to get on with it!
Spat Nick as he tried to scramble away. Jonas felt the rage build inside him and quickened his pace. The bushes to his right rustled. Why do you have to be so noble, Shirley? It didn't have to end this way. He felt sick. If she still had the gun, she was a more pressing threat than the nearly dead Ventnor. He turned on his heel and faced the bushes where he suspected she was hiding. This was not how it was supposed to go. Jonas felt an odd sensation as his eyes widened and his pulse quickened. A distinct fear ran through his body, strange and unfamiliar. It was a primal notion that he had just gone from predator to prey.
God damn it, Shirley! I told you to!
Huge, lumbering footsteps shook the clearing. The thicket in front of him parted. And moving with deadly speed, a massive 10-foot-tall, ape-like creature ran out to the bushes. You've got to be fucking kidding me. Jonas felt small and very afraid. He looked up into the wrinkled, angry face of the real item, and he understood how all the hikers he had encountered over the years felt. Their terrified screams, their pleading. He had the urge to do it all, despite knowing it was useless. Before he had the chance, in one smooth motion, the creature picked Jonas up in a muscular hand and squeezed. The Sasquatch snarled, revealing black gums over a terrible set of gnashing teeth. Jonas felt the sickening sensation of bones popping and immeasurable pain flooding his body. A black circle closed around his vision to the point where all he could see were the dark eyes staring at him. Even through the agonizing pain, he could not help but appreciate the irony of the moment. The legend would be done justice after all. The creature flung Jonah sideways. He could only watch as tree bark rushed towards his face. Maybe Shirley will even write a story about it. Chapter 17. The End. Shirley watched from concealment, mouth agape as the man in the suit advanced for the killing blow. She was no more than 15 feet away and directly behind him. Carefully, she thumbed back the hammer on her revolver and took aim. The barrel was pointed square at the man's back. Even if the bullet couldn't get through what she now suspected was his armor, it was going to hurt.
A real Sasquatch would have the decency to get on with
Just as she curled her finger around the trigger, a sound broke her concentration. From the thicket to her right, there came a sound of heavy footfalls, shaking the ground beneath her. She barely had time to gasp as a creature far larger than the man standing above Nick charged from the bushes and roared a horrifying, chilling sound. It didn't take much guesswork for Shirley to understand that this was the real deal. And somehow, their situation had just gone from bad to worse. The Sasquatch picked up the imposter like a rag doll and squeezed the man in its fist. The sheer terror Shirley felt reduced her thoughts to repetitive curse words.
Shit!
Nick still lay on the ground, bleeding badly, but regarding the murderous creature next to him with almost wonderment. His limbs moved slowly, trying to push himself away, but he was not making much progress. Without further thought, Shirley moved out of concealment, hoping the creature would remain distracted long enough for them to escape. She tried to run as quietly as possible, but in her fright, each step might as well have been cannon fire. It did not matter. For the moment, the creature was still distracted, squeezing the life out of the man in its hand. Shirley kept her revolver trained on it, right up until the moment she got to Nick.
Look, Shirley.
He slurred, eyes half closed.
That's the real thing.
At that moment, the Sasquatch flung its prey into a nearby tree with a mighty crack. It lumbered over to the spot where the body fell, as if to confirm the imposter was dead.
We need to leave now.
Nick's eyes were glazed over, and his head lolled back like a man on the verge of sleep.
Can you believe it? I really thought it was just a man in a suit.
Shirley looked down at his wound and gagged. He was losing a lot of blood, and unless she could slow it down, he was going to die. Moving as quickly as she could, she cut away the tattered shreds of Nick's coat arm and wrapped them around it. It wasn't a tourniquet by any stretch of the imagination, but precision could wait for a less desperate time. She put an arm under Nick and tried to hoist him.
I would have packed differently.
Nick gestured limply to his pistol that had been tossed in the snow.
I don't think that's going to do anything but piss it off.
He trailed off, going silent. Shirley continued to strain, trying to support his weight and get them to some form of concealment.
Shirley?
She pushed forward,
Shirley?
feeling the burning in her legs.
Shirley?
Yes, Nick?
And then stopped, noticing the silence. Moist air blew across the back of her neck, and she could hear the heavy panting of the beast standing behind her. Very slowly, she turned around to see the massive beast staring down at them through sunken eyes. The creature let out a low, harsh growl.
Nick, this is kind of your area of expertise. What do we do now?
Nick held out his fingers as if counting them.
Well, if my calculations are correct, we should never have been this close.
The beast made a fist with one hand and beat it against his chest.
Easy now.
Tried Shirley, sticking a hand out in front of her.
It's not a horse, Shirley.
You don't want to hurt.
The creature lumbered over, scooping up Nick and let out another mighty roar. Nick's eyes bulged with effort and terror. He tried to scream, but managed only a muted gasp as the air was squeezed out of him. Shirley watched in terror and did the only thing she could. Picking the revolver out of the snow, she brushed it off, took quick aim at the creature's massive arm, and fired. The shot rang out like thunder, and the beast snarled as the slug hit. Shirley was pulling the trigger to fire again when the creature swatted her, knocking her onto her back and sending the gun flying. No longer interested in Nick, the Sasquatch dropped him in the snow and advanced on Shirley. She tried to move her arms and legs, but the blow had knocked the wind out of her. In a daze, she looked up at the massive ape and wondered how it had remained hidden for all these years. The creature raised its fist into the air, preparing to smash her body into a bloody pulp. Shirley stared straight at it, wishing she believed in an afterlife where she could see Lindsay again.
Get on with it!
Somehow, being faced with the real thing was less terrifying. Just as the beast was about to bring its mighty hands down, there was a loud boom in the distance, followed by the rumble of thunder. The creature hesitated, cocking its head to the side. For a moment, it did nothing, just listening as the thunder continued.
Thunder doesn't last this long.
The creature took a final look at her, as if weighing the options, and then ran off into the forest, shaking the ground with each footfall. The thunder continued. Shirley pushed herself to a sitting position and saw Nick, miraculously still alive, doing the same. She crawled over to him, ignoring the exhaustion and great soreness in her limbs.
Nick, we need to get moving. Now!
I think I'm fine right here. Do you fancy a drink?
He pulled out a flask. The rumbling thunder continued and grew louder. Shirley looked up at the mountain, knowing exactly what was coming. Using all her will, she stood and tried to get Nick to do the same. Despite the urgency, her movements were sluggish, as if she were moving in a dream.
That's an avalanche, Nick.
Oh, goody.
Shirley began to hobble quicker, trying to get to the highest ground she could. But it was too late. The rumbling continued to grow. Soon, she could see it. A wall of white crashing down the mountain. It wasn't huge by any measure, but any avalanche was hard to outrun.
Nick!
She stammered, trying desperately to drag him to the side. Nick's head lolled towards the oncoming avalanche, and fear filled his eyes once more.
Nick! When it hits, hold on to me and take a deep breath!
Nick wrapped his arms around her obediently.
Any other tips?
Yeah. When you wake up, try spitting to know which way is up.
When Shirley awoke, she was in a hospital bed. As she tilted her head to get a better look around, she felt an incredible soreness in her neck.
What the hell happened to me?
The last thing Shirley remembered was the ground shaking beneath her and a horrible roar. Her thoughts were interrupted as a man burst into her room, wearing nothing but a hospital gown and a look of bewilderment. He looked around wildly, searching for something, and his eyes landed on her.
Shirley, I don't have time to explain. I'm sure you're in a lot of pain, but we need to get out of here right now.
The figure swam into focus and she recognized him.
Nick?
She asked, feeling a dryness of her throat.
How long?
8 hours, give or take.
He was practically panting with each word and paced the room nervously as he spoke.
I guess rescue was on the way and found your avalanche beacon.
He glanced out the door and into the hallway.
Shit! We don't have a lot of time.
Nick pulled the knife from beneath his hospital robes and hurried to Shirley's bedside. Her first concern was not the fact he was wielding a weapon, but more of a question as to where he had been keeping it. In the end, she was helpless and weak. If he was going to stab her, fine. At least she'd get some rest. She closed her eyes and almost sank into a fuzzy sleep. The sound of leather being cut and loosening around her wrists brought her back to consciousness.
Why would they strap me down?
Like I said, no time.
Nick removed the IV from her arm, tossed it to the ground, and looked her in the eyes.
All right, when I take these off.
He motioned to the vital monitors she was wearing.
They're going to trip an alarm and bring the nurses running.
He did a quick check over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to come through the door at any moment.
We need to be out of here before they arrive.
Wait a minute.
Her memory snapped into place suddenly, and the room took a painful clarity.
We were in an avalanche. The Sasquatch was real.
Nick rolled his eyes.
Yes, of course it was. Now let's get moving.
Once more, he checked over his shoulder. Sweat was beading down his neck.
Why can't I stay here? Shouldn't the nurses check me out?
Nick was growing impatient.
We don't have much time, but suffice it to say, your Beast of the Mountain was funded by some high-up organisations that aren't happy the secret is out.
He jerked a thumb towards the door.
That explosion? That was them trying to get rid of the evidence.
Shirley's mind spun. After all these years, she had finally wound up in one of the tabloid stories George would write about.
What a world.
Still, it did seem far-fetched.
What makes you think they're going to be coming here?
Because I woke up tied down to a hospital bed too. And after I cut myself free, I noticed the suits in the hallway. Now if we could hurry the hell up, because they're going to notice my monitors are hooked up to the kind man who shared my room.
Shirley stumbled out of bed, willing her slow limbs to work properly.
How are we going to get out of here?
The small room provided no safe exit. There was only the door Nick had come through. And a window.
You're not going to like it.
Absolutely not.
Well, it's either that or see what the G-Men had planned for you.
Nick crossed the room towards the window and opened it. It wouldn't budge past the halfway mark. Frustrated, he stepped back and kicked it. The flimsy wooden frame shattered outward. He poked his head out and let out a sigh of relief.
This is gonna hurt, but we'll live.
He clambered out the window.
See you on the other side.
Shirley sat there, stunned, unsure of what to do. She looked at the door, but couldn't hear anything over the blaring alarm.
Fuck it.
She looked out and saw Nick climbing from a dumpster just below. A beat-up sedan pulled up next to him, and a young man with messy brown hair stepped out.
What the hell, Nick?
He said, looking him up and down.
Shut up, James. We're gonna have company. Clear off the back seat.
Nick looked up at the window.
Oh, for the love of it, Shirley, just jump!
He then began to berate James as he quickly tossed garbage out the passenger side door.
You call this a getaway vehicle? It's filthy!
Have you seen your apartment?
The whole scene was so odd that Shirley had forgotten about the immediate danger. She was halfway out the window when the door to her hospital room burst open and a woman in a black suit raced in, pistol drawn.
We've got another runner!
She shouted down the hall before turning her attention back to Shirley.
Miss Codwell, think about this.
Her voice was calm, but Shirley could see her finger inching towards the trigger. Shirley gaped for a second, gave the woman the finger, and rolled out the window into the dumpster. The fall was much shorter than she imagined, and the smell at the bottom was somehow worse. Recovering as fast as she could, Shirley scrambled over the trash bags and rolled out of the dumpster onto the pavement, right as the first shot ricocheted off the dumpster. Nick helped her to her feet and pushed her into the back seat of the sedan. He ran around the front and jumped into the passenger seat. The driver extended a hand to Shirley.
James Schaefer, nice
Oh,
to...
for the love of God, James! Drive!
The second bullet hit the car hood and James stepped on the gas. The tyres screeched and they pulled away. The back window shattered as another shot rang out. But before long, they were on the main road, headed out of Clearwater at a shocking pace.
Where the hell are we going to go, Nick? And what the hell are we going to do about my car?
First stop, safe house. We're going to leave Shirley with the order and let them sort it out. They've got ties with the sick side and might be able to work something out. Then you can drop me at the airport. I just bid on a job in Nepal and I don't want to be late.
I'm sorry, what?
Asked Shirley, bringing herself to a sitting position. As her wits came back to her, she couldn't help but feel a little pissed. I'm sorry, Shirley. I truly am. But you chased the monster and now you got to deal with the consequences. Same as us. But what can I say? The monster hunting life takes all kinds. And with a little training, you'll do just fine. Nick winked at her, pulled a full bottle of whiskey from the glove compartment and took a swig. Shirley thought about trying to protest and then remembered that she had just been shot at.
Well, if it pays better than the local eye.
I can assure you it doesn't. But if you live long enough, it'll be a hell of a lot more interesting. Nick Ventnor and James Schaefer return in Whiteout by Ashton Macaulay, available at Amazon and all good online bookstores. Shirley Codwell will return. This has been Man of the Mountain, written by Ashton Macaulay, narrated by Lee James and featuring performances by Lee James and Sarah Ruth Thomas. Additional character voices by Iggy Kid. Contact us through Twitter, Ashton Macaulay at Real Mac Ashton, Aberrant Literature at Aberrant Lit, Lee James at Warcroft, Sarah Ruth Thomas at Sarah Ruth Voice, Iggy Kid at Iggy D Kid. Music and sound effects licensed under Creative Commons. Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Punch Deck at punch_deck. Julian Callor, YouTube Julian Callor. This audio version of Man of the Mountain is published by Aberrant Literature. For more information on current and upcoming releases in both print and audio format, visit aberrantliterature.com.